Currently, all buttons in our project are displayed in the same way. They all have gray color. And now we're going to create different button types. And we'll start with the button which is located inside of base select component. As we can see, this component contains base button. So let's open up base button component, and right here we're gonna create new script tag, and inside we're gonna declare new constant with the name type classes. And keys of this object will represent different button types. For now, we're gonna declare two types, neutral and danger. And we're going to extract specific classes that should be applied to only neutral buttons from this list of classes and assign these classes to neutral key. So all neutral buttons in our case will have gray background. And danger buttons will have almost the same classes, but the color will be red. And also for buttons of type danger, we're gonna use white color for the text. And then in the template, we're going to interpolate the following expression inside of class attribute. To this list of classes, we're gonna add specific classes depending on the type of the current button. We will extract specific classes from the type classes object based on value of the type variable. And this type will be property of this component, which will be passed from outside whenever we use base button components. So let's go up and define one property for this component by using macro define props. Let's say that default type for our buttons will be neutral, and the type of this property will be string. Validation rules for this property we will define a little bit later. And for now, let's go to activity item component and pass this property to base button component. In this component, we have button to delete activity. So in this case, inside of the type property, we'll pass danger type. And before we test this in a browser, let's go back to base button component and use curly braces instead of square brackets to declare object, since constant type classes holds an object. And indeed, in the browser we will see two different buttons, red one and a gray one. So our newly defined button types work properly. Let's go back to the editor and explicitly define available button types in the form of constants. Inside of constants.js, we're gonna export two additional constants, which will represent button types. Names of those constants would be button type danger and button type neutral, with corresponding values. And down here, we're also going to declare constant array of all available button types based on those constants declared above. So we're gonna use these constants in this array, make all letters uppercase, just to follow conventions of naming constants. And now we're gonna have to use these newly created constants inside of our base button component. So let's write an import statement for both of these constants. We are importing those constants from constants module. And now let's reference constant button type neutral as the default value for property type. And then down here where we declare type classes object, we're gonna use dynamic object keys just to specify our button types. And since these are dynamic values, we're gonna have to wrap those in square brackets. And then let's go back to activity item component, where we passed type to base button component. And now instead of passing static string, we're gonna import constant button type danger. And this constant will be sent as value for property type into base button component. So after doing those changes, we are not supposed to see any visual differences. But now in our project, we have two different button types explicitly declared in the form of constants. And now if we're gonna need to declare another button type, all we have to do is to add another constant to represent different button type. After this, let's go back to base button component, and in here, we're gonna write validation function for property type. Let's call this validation function isButtonTypeValid, and I'll use the link to this function in the key validator inside of prop configuration object. And this validation function will be pretty similar to another function with the name isPageValid. So we're gonna copy body of this isPageValid function, paste it inside of our new function. But in this case, we're gonna have to check if the passed button type is included within array of all button types, which we store inside of button types constant. And now all we have to do is to import this button types constant from within constants module. And this way we can be sure that the property with a name type inside of base button component will receive valid button type. Otherwise, we're gonna get warning in browser console. And let's simulate the situation where we pass wrong button type inside of type prop in here. And just like that, we're gonna receive corresponding validation warnings in our console. And of course, the red background color for the delete activity button wasn't applied. So let's revert changes we have just done to activity item component, and let's finish this lesson. Currently on activities page we have 6 button components. And as a reminder, in our application, button is represented by base button component. And this component contains local object called type classes, which stores CSS classes for every button type. But the thing is that everything that is contained within script tag in every Vue component is executed every time we initialize a new instance of this component, which also means that our type classes object will be created every time we will create new base button component. And just to make sure that it is really the case, we're gonna print something in a console in here and see how many times this instruction will be printed. And in a browser we have the following, saying that base button log was printed 30 times. And the reason why it was printed 30 times is that on activities page we currently have 6 base button components, and also we have 24 instances of base button on timeline component. So in total we get 30 button components initialized in our application, which proves the point that this log was executed exactly 30 times. One time per component instance, as well as everything that is contained within a script of Vue component. But since type classes object should be the same for all base button components, it doesn't really make sense to recreate it every time we're gonna initialize a new base button component. And for such cases, whenever we need some logic to run only once, when component module gets initialized, instead of using script with keyword setup, we can use normal script tag. And right here we will place initialization logic that will not be related to any particular Vue component instance. We're gonna place here our object type classes, since this is a static object, and it will be the same for all base button components. So this way we're gonna make this object be initialized only once. And of course here we reference some constants, so let's cut import instruction from here and move it to our new script tag. And after doing all these changes, in the browser we're supposed to see that log base button will be printed only once, which is exactly the case in here. No matter how many button components were created during lifetime of the application, we still get only one base button log, because that script tag where we put that log is actually module initialization script and not component initialization script, so it will be processed only once. Let's remove this log statement from here. And so in cases when we need to execute some initialization logic, which is not directly related to a particular instance of Vue component, we can use normal script tag. But please note, such Vue-specific functions as define props, define emits, ref, computed, etc., they all are directly related to a particular Vue component instance, and therefore they should be called inside of script with a keyword setup. And that is why we haven't moved this define props macro inside of our normal script tag. On timeline page we have several select boxes, which let us specify particular activity for every hour in a day. And the thing is that list of options within those select elements is going to be dynamic and will be dependent on the current activities in our application. Because at runtime we're gonna be able to add activities to this list as well as remove them. And our list of activity options on the timeline page will depend on list of activities. But currently this list of activities is just a simple array called activities that is initialized in the root component and passed down to the activities component as a prop. So when it comes to activities, our main source of truth will be app component, because this is the component where activities array is declared. And by the way, inside of every timeline item component, we also have a local array of options for select elements called options. And this array of options is completely unrelated and doesn't depend on the current state of activities. So we're gonna have to generate this array of options based on the current state of activities array within root component. And let's do it step by step. Firstly, we will open timeline item component, where that local array of options is declared. This array is used to render select elements on timeline page, but now we're gonna make it so this component will receive options array from outside, inside of prop called activity select options. Let's specify configuration for this property. It will be required, and the type will be an array, since this prop is gonna contain array of options for select element. And now this received array of options we're gonna have to pass down to base select component in the options property. And finally, we can easily remove that static array called options and go to app component. And here, right under activities constant, we're gonna create another constant, which is going to hold array of options that we're going to generate dynamically by using generate activity select options function. And since our array of activity options will be dependent on activities, we're gonna have to supply this function with a list of activities stored within activities constant. This will be a new function that we're gonna declare inside of functions module. So first of all, let's import this function from that module, generate activity select options. And now let's go ahead and switch over to functions module. Here we go to the very bottom and declare new function with the name generate activity select options. As we already agreed that this function should accept a list of activities, let's declare one parameter with the name activities. And here we're gonna loop over this array of activities and map every item from this array into a proper option object that is recognized by our base select component. So every item from activities array will be a string. We'll call it label. It will represent activity name. And as a second argument, map method will pass index of the current array item into this closure. And for the time being, we're gonna use this index as an identifier for a particular activity. And then all we have to do within this closure is return transformed value. And this value will be an object with properties label and value. And at the end, we're gonna get array of objects with keys label and value that correspond to every activity names. And once this function has run in the app component, we're gonna receive a generated array of activity options inside of activity select options constant. And this array we're gonna have to pass down to the timeline component. Let's add new prop in here with the name activity select options and pass our constant activity select options. Then inside of the timeline component, we'll have to accept this prop. So within define props macro, let's declare another key activity select options with configuration object. We'll specify that this property will be required to pass, and the type of this property will be array. Validation for this property we'll describe a little bit later, and for now let's scroll down, and on timeline item component, let's add a new prop with the name activity select options, passing here our array of generated activity options from root component. And eventually this array of options will end up inside of timeline item component. Let's add here validator key so we don't forget to specify validation for this property later. And finally, base component that is used in here is going to use that array of options to render options for select element. And now to make sure that array of options will be a valid data, we're gonna specify validation function for activity select option prop with the name validate activity select options. And as always, this validation function should be imported from validators module. Let's mention the name in here. And in fact, if we take a look inside of validators.js file, we can see here the function with the name validate select options. And we can actually reuse this function to validate array object inside of array of options. So we don't even need to declare new function. Instead, let's go back to timeline item and use that existing function with the name validate select options. And also let's use a proper name right here for validator key. And let's see what rules will be applied to every object inside of array of options. So first of all, value should be a number, and the label property should be a string. And those properties, value and label, are properties that will be contained within every object that represents one option of select box element. So let's continue and import one more validation function inside of the timeline component. The validation function we need is called validate select options. And we're gonna apply this validation function for prop with the name activity select options. So let's take a look in the browser and see what we got up until this point. Now we generate activity select options within app component, which is stored in this activity select options constant. And now this is dynamically generated array of activity options based on the current state of activities array. So when in the future we're gonna add or remove activities in our application, the activity select options array will be reevaluated and we'll get updated array of activity select options. And then this array of options is getting passed to the timeline component as activity select options prop, as we can see right here. And then from the timeline component, it gets passed further to every timeline item component. And finally, this options prop gets passed to base select component, which renders our select list on the screen, based on the passed options array, of course. And you may have also noticed that by default, these select boxes show second activity as currently selected. So let's go back to timeline item component, and as a default value for selected activity ID reactive variable, we'll use an ID of the first activity, which in this case is 0. And now all select boxes show first activity as currently selected with the name coding. Next, let's see what is going to happen if we're gonna specify empty label for activity options. In that function that generates activity select options, we're gonna manually assign empty string to the label property. And it will be no surprise if we'll take a look inside of Vue DevTools, expand objects within activity select options, and see that all label properties have empty string, which is of course reflected in the UI. So every select element shows empty string. And all options within those lists also don't have any label. So in this case, preferably to show validation warning if we accidentally will specify empty string as a value for the label property of options object. So inside of this function, is select option valid, we need to check that label is not only a string, but that is not an empty string. And we can do so by reusing another validator with the name is not empty string. And this way, Vue in the console will inform us that we have passed empty string to label property of option objects. So validation fails for option property that we pass inside of base select component. And this way we can be sure that whenever we specify an empty string for the label property in here, we will receive a proper validation warning in the browser's console. So let's revert this change and finally check everything in the browser to make sure that no warnings are shown. Everything looks good. Let's start working on the functionality of removing activity items. So whenever we click on this delete button, this activity item should disappear from the page. So let's see what we're gonna have to do in order for this to happen. By clicking on the delete button, we will fire an event from the component activity item to the parent component, the activities. And then the activities component will fire one more event to root component up, so that the root component could remove corresponding activity item from the activities array. And just because based on this activities array, we render activity list items on the page, after removing item from this array, we also should see corresponding list item disappearing from the page. So first of all, let's bind listener to the delete button inside of activity item component, in here, let's find base button component. This component represents that button to remove activity. And so by using event directive with an event name click, here we're gonna fire another event with a name delete to parent component. In other words, when we click on this delete button, we'll fire another custom event with name delete. And just because we have to explicitly declare custom events that are fired from within some component, we need to use macro define emits. And here we'll use event name as a key, delete, and then we're gonna specify validation function for this event. And since we do not send any data along with the delete event to parent component, that means by default, undefined value will be sent. So as a validation function for delete event, we can use our function isUndefined, which we will check that the actual value which is passed along with delete event is indeed undefined. Then let's scroll up and import this isUndefined function from validators module. And if we take a look inside of validators.js file, we will see that currently isUndefined function is private. So to make it importable from outside, we need to use export keyword in here. And for better code organization, let's move this function and place it next to other functions that we export. And the same thing let's do with define emits macro. We're gonna group define props and define emits macros together inside of activity item component. And now since we fire custom event delete to parent component, which in our case is the activities component, we need to go to the activities component and on activity item component, let's register a listener for our custom event with the name delete. And when this event is received, we're going to fire another custom event with the name delete activity, but in this case to the root component up. And in order for root component to know which activity we'd like to remove, we also have to pass activity name along with this event. We can get access to the current activity name by using activity loop variable. Let's pass it as a second argument to emit function. And we also have to use macro define emits in this component to declare our custom event with the name delete activity. But in this case, we send data along with this event, which is activity name, so we can use validation function called isActivityValid in here, which will properly validate that the data that will be passed along with delete activity event is indeed a valid activity name. Currently, all activities are represented by simple strings, so this validation function will ensure that the activity name is not an empty string. And now, as always, let's import validation function isActivityValid from validators module. And next, we're gonna switch to app component and register listener for delete activity event on the activities component. As a listener in this case, we're gonna specify a reference to local function with the name delete activity. So let's scroll up to script tag and in here create new function with this name, which we will accept one parameter, which is activity name. And all that this function will have to do is to remove one element from activities array. We're gonna remove item from this array by its index by using native JavaScript method called splice. As a first parameter in here, we have to specify an index of an element we'd like to remove. And we can obtain this index by using another native JavaScript function called indexOf. Here we should pass an item index of which we'd like to find. And as a second argument to this splice method, we are passing amount of elements we'd like to remove, starting from an index specified in the first parameter. And now let's see in the browser what is going to happen after we will click on delete button. Note that initially activities array contains 3 activities. And once I click on delete button, we're gonna see that array activities now contains 2 elements, which means that our custom events are being properly handled, and we are successfully removing item from activities array declared within a root component. But actually on the page, deleted activity still remains in the list. So our UI state does not reflect our internal state, because activities list in the UI should depend on activities array. So currently Vue cannot detect changes of activities array because this array is not reactive, and therefore those UI parts that depend on activities array For example, the activities component, they are not automatically re-rendered whenever activities array changes. So in order to fix it, we just have to make activities array reactive array by using a ref function. And just because a ref function returns an object with value property which stores value of reactive variable, we're gonna have to reference our reactive array by using value property. So let's use value property in here when we're passing array of activities to generate activity select options function. And also we have to do the same thing inside of delete activity function, where we reference activities array. Now we're gonna get access to this reactive array by using value property. So now since this activities variable is reactive, Vue should detect changes whenever this array will be modified by adding items or removing items from it. And then those parts of the UI which depend on this reactive variable will automatically be re-rendered, such as our activities component, which displays list of activities. And now after we click on the delete activity button, instantly we will see that the activity list item will disappear. And at the same time, one item will be removed from activities array. Don't forget that this activities array gets declared within the root component, and then it gets passed as a prop to the activities component. Let's go ahead and try to remove last item of this list. So now we are left with only one item in the activities array. And finally, if we will delete remaining item from this list, the activities array will become empty. So right now our UI state is fully dependent on the state of the activities array. And just because currently we don't have any option to add new activities, we need to do a full page refresh in order to get all activities back. Now that we already have a way to remove activities, it's time to start working on functionality to add activities. So in this lesson we're going to work on activity creation form. We'll start from the activities component. This is the component where we will add markup for activities form. So let's go to the activities component, and right after list, let's add form element with one input field. And right after this input field, we're also going to add button to send this form. We will use base button component, and as a default slot, we'll pass icon component with name plus icon. This icon corresponds to plus sign. And at the same time, let's also specify height for this icon, 8 units. And then at the top, let's go and import those components. First of all, we're gonna import base component for button from components folder. And also let's add an import for plus icon component. We can copy the path for this import from another file, constants.js. Let's copy this path and paste into this import. And now on the page, at the very bottom, we're supposed to see one input field with plus button. And that is exactly what we're seeing right here. And now let's start applying CSS classes to make this form be fixed at the bottom. So when we will scroll this page, the form will always be visible in a viewport. And for that, let's add class sticky, which is going to set CSS property position with value sticky. We will position this form at the very bottom of this page by using class bottom0. We'll also make this form flexible container, and the distance between child elements will be 2 units. Let's add top border and make background color white. And paddings from all sides will be 4 units. But at the moment, if we take a look on the page, we will see that sometimes this form gets hidden behind navigation. So we will move this form a little bit up by using absolute value, for example, 57 pixels. And now as we can see, whenever we scroll the page, this form always stays visible. Let's go ahead and stretch input field so it covers all available space by using class wfull. We're also going to round corners, add border from all sides, horizontal paddings will be 4 units, and let's increase font size. And this form looks much better right now. Let's go back to the editor and add placeholder attribute with some text, for example, activity name. After all that, we're going to introduce another button type in our project, which will be primary type. And we're gonna make this button which submits this form primary button. So let's go to constants.js, where we have all constants that represent different types. And here let's declare new constant for primary type. We're gonna follow our conventions and call this constant button type primary. And also, since we store all button types in one array called button types, let's add one more entry, which is this constant button type primary. But this is not all. We also have to specify CSS classes that should be applied to all buttons with primary type. And for that, let's go to base button component. First of all, we're gonna import our new constant button type primary. And then down here in this type classes object, let's add another key and specify which CSS classes should be applied to all primary buttons. For example, let's make all primary buttons purple. For that, we're gonna rename a couple of classes in here and use purple color. And then we'll make it so all buttons, whenever we don't specify type explicitly, will be primary buttons. So as a default value for type prop, we're gonna use this button type primary constant. And currently on the page, all buttons that were previously neutral buttons have received purple color. But this is definitely not what we want, so we need to go back to base select component. In here, we'll import button type neutral constant from constants module. And we will explicitly say that all buttons next to select boxes should remain neutral. So we have to override default value for type prop whenever we pass it to base button component. In this case, we're passing button type neutral constant. And now all select box buttons have become gray again, and the only button which is primary is the button to submit activity creation form. And this is what we have expected. So in the next lesson, we're gonna work on functionality to create new activities. So now we already have a form to create new activities. But this is just a basic markup, and in this lesson we're gonna get to functionality. So when this form is sent, we're gonna add new item to activities array and eventually display new activity on the page. And in order to do so, firstly we need to create a variable which will store state of the input field. We can do this inside of the activities component. So let's create a variable called new activity. And now we're gonna have to bind value of this variable to our input field. So in here we're gonna use vbind directive and bind value of new activity variable to value attribute. And just to check if it works, let's set some initial value to this new activity variable and check it in the browser. And what we're supposed to see right now is that input field should contain word new. And that is exactly what we see right here. And also on the right side, we see that variable new activity has the same value. And the next step would be to make it so that whenever value of text field is updated, it should also automatically update state variable new activity. In other words, we're gonna have to keep text field with state variable new activity in sync. So let's listen for event called input on this input field. And when this event occurs, that means that the value inside of text field has changed. And we're gonna assign the new text in this text field to our new activity variable. So by using special event variable, we can get the reference to current input field via target property. And this DOM element contains value property, which stores current text in this field. So after that, let's try to modify text and see what's gonna happen to a new activity variable. And as we can see, it was just updated with a new value inside of text field. So moving on, and the next step would be to listen for event of this form submission whenever we press enter while being focused on the input field, or when we click on the corresponding button. And once we catch submission event, we should fire another event from the activities component to our root component. Because the root component stores an array of activities, which is our main source of truth for list of activities. So we should manipulate list of activities on the page by modifying this activities array. So let's go back and assign event listener for submit event to this form. And once this form gets submitted, we're gonna fire another event called create activity to parent component. And along with that, we should tell parent component the name of the new activity. And since new activity name is stored within new activity variable, we just need to pass this variable in here as a second argument. And just to prevent default browser behavior whenever we send form, so it will not fully refresh the page, we can use special modifier called prevent right after event name. And this way browser's default behavior will be prevented and we will be able to handle for submission in our own way. So let's go ahead and see what will happen when we will send this form. And in a console we're gonna see a warning that our custom component just fired an event create activity. But we have not declared this event yet by using define emits macro. So let's go back to our component and explicitly specify event name create activity within this object along with validation function is activity valid. Because with this event we're sending activity name to parent component. So is activity valid, function will make sure that our new activity name will not be empty. And of course, since we fired this event, we also need to register listener in the parent component called app. Let's add event directive with the name create activity on the activities component. And the function which is going to handle this event will be create activity. So let's declare this local function in the script tag. Here we're gonna use one parameter activity, which this function will receive. And all this function has to do is to add one more activity to our activities array. And since this array is reactive, we need to reference value property and use method push to push new array item to the end of this array. So this way we're adding new activity name to the end of activities array. And because this array is reactive, Vue is supposed to detect changes made to this array, and based on new value of this array, it will re-render those parts of the UI which depend on this array. So now in the browser, after we submit the form to create new activity, we're gonna see that our new activity sleeping was just added to activities array in the app component. And of course, based on the new value of activities array, Vue has just re-rendered our list of activities, and we can see our new activity at the end of this list. So now whenever we will keep adding new activities, our activities array will be updated and new activities will appear on the page. And now let's go one more time through all the flow of creating new activity. We'll start from the activities component. Here we have activity form, which when it gets submitted, fires another create activity event to root component and also passes the name of the new activity to parent component. And then parent component listens for this create activity event and accepts new activity name as the first parameter to the function create activity. And then this function adds new activity name to the activities array, which is reactive. So all those parts of our UI which depend on activities array will be re-rendered. In this particular case, we can see that the activities component depends on activities array because we pass this array as a prop to this component. And then inside of this component, that for loop will run again, and this time it's gonna render our list of activities, including our newly added activity, since our new activity is contained within activities array at the end. And this way, every activity item component corresponds to individual element from activities array. So now let's just go back to the activities component and reset value of new activity variable. So initially our text field within activity form will be empty. In this lesson we're going to extract everything related to activity form into its own component. So we're gonna go to the activities component, find markup for activity form, and right here let's create new component with the name the activity form. And since this is the only place where this activity form component will be used, I named this file by using the prefix. And then inside of components folder, let's create new file the activity form. Here we're gonna paste markup of that form. And first of all, we just need to move some imports from the activities component into the activity form component. So let's create empty script tag, go back to the activities component, and let's cut a few imports from here. Import of an icon and import of base button. And then paste it inside of the activity form. And we don't need to reference components folder to import base button, since this component is located in the same folder as base button component. Also, we're gonna have to move state variable which stores current text within text field. This variable is called newActivity. Let's cut it from here and paste it inside of the activity form component. And then in order to use our new form component, let's import this component in the activities component from components folder. And then going back to the activity form component, and let's rename the event which gets sent whenever we submit this form. The name will be submit. And let's also create separate handler function which will be called submit, which is gonna send submit event to parent component. And to make things a little cleaner here, let's rename newActivity variable on just activity. There is also one more occurrence of this newActivity variable inside of template, so let's rename it also in here. And since we have renamed the event name, which gets sent whenever we submit activity creation form, let's just copy over macro define emits, put it inside of the activity form component, and specify proper event name. In our case, it is submit. The validation function can remain the same, which we will basically make sure that the activity name is not an empty string whenever we send activity name along with submit event to parent component. So as always, we need to import validation function in this file. Let's copy import from here and move it to the activity form. And keep only import for is activity valid function. Alright, so let's go through all the flow of creation activity again. Firstly, whenever we submit activity creation form, the event with the name submit is sent to parent component. And of course, to accept new activity name, we have to listen for submit event from the activities component. Let's add a listener here for submit event. And once we get this event, we're gonna tell parent component that we wanna create new activity by sending another event with the name create activity. And just to tell activity name we'd like to create, we pass it as an argument in here. So by using this special constant event, we get access to the data which was sent along with submit event from child component. And this create activity event is already declared within define emits macro. So all we have to do is go to parent component. In here, we already listened for create activity event. And as a listener, we use create activity local function. This is a very simple function which is going to add new activity to the end of activities array. And because our activities array is reactive, by adding new item to this array, Vue is gonna re-render some parts of the view which rely on this reactive array, for example, our activities list. And this way, new list item will be created and added on the page. So after we submit the form to create new activity, the event with the name submit is sent to the activities component, and along with this event, we send value which is stored within local variable activity. And then this new activity name will be added to the total array of activities. As we can see, we have a new entry in this array. And indeed, we see that the new activity sleeping has been created and added to the bottom of this page. So now we have an isolated component which represents activity form, which encapsulates all the logic needed to create new activities. Previously, we have implemented synchronization of local variable activity with text inside of input field, so that whenever the text will be modified, it will instantly update our local variable. But there is another way which Vue provides us with, which is much easier, to basically do the same thing, synchronize some variable with input field. So inside of the activity form component, we were previously using vbind directive to bind the activity variable to value attribute. And then we attached listener for input event, and whenever this event occurred, we were manually updating value of activity variable. And for such cases, Vue provides us with another directive called vmodel that will automatically do synchronization of variable with input field. So we need to specify variable name that we wish to bind to this input. In our case, it is activity variable. And basically this notation replaces previous two lines. So now these lines can be removed. So now in the browser, if we will type text inside of input field, we will see the same result. Value of activity variable will be properly updated. And sure enough, after submission of this form, we're gonna see new list item at the bottom of the page. So new activity was created. But let's also improve user experience a bit by resetting value in this text field after form submission. And we're gonna add the line to clear value of input field within this submit handler. Right after the form gets submitted, we're gonna manually assign empty string to activity variable. And just because this variable is bound to an input field, we're supposed to see that the field will be cleared. But what we actually see in the browser, the text remains in the field. So our current implementation does not really work as expected. And that is happening because currently our activity variable isn't reactive. And Vue does not monitor changes made to this variable and doesn't re-render certain parts of the DOM that rely on this variable, for example, our input field. So even after assigning empty string to activity variable, changes are not reflected within input field on the page. And just to make Vue update DOM structure whenever activity variable will change, we're gonna turn this variable into a reactive variable by using ref function in here. And now everywhere where we reference activity variable, now we need to reference value property. Let's do it in here. And also when we assign empty string. And this way you should detect that we assigned empty string to a reactive variable, and it should go ahead and clear text field. So let's also not forget an import ref function from the Vue package at the top of this file. And right now in the browser, after submitting this form, we will notice that the text field got cleared. And since we no longer reassign activity variable, it makes sense to make this variable constant. And finally, one more improvement that we can do to activity creation form is to disable submission button whenever text field is empty. So let's assign new attribute in here called disabled. And we're gonna determine when to disable this button based on the following condition. Here we're gonna compare activity variable with empty string. So whenever text field will be empty, this button should get disabled. And thanks to Vue attribute inheritance, all attributes specified on components that are also not declared by macro-defined props or define emits, they are automatically get inherited by the root element of component. And in our case, root element of base button component is button element, so that disabled attribute will be applied to this button. And looks like it is working. We see that the button was disabled. But in fact, if input field will only contain space characters, the button gets activated and we have a way to submit this form, and then we're gonna end up with empty activity name. And just to prevent this from happening, in this expression, let's use method trim to trim empty spaces on both sides of this string before comparison. And finally, it is working as expected. Whenever I type empty spaces, we see that the button remains disabled. And only when I type one non-empty character, I will be able to submit this form. In this lesson, we're going to improve user experience a little bit by automatically scrolling the page after new activity was created, so that users could see that new activity was added on the page. So let's see how we can do this. Inside of the activity form component, whenever we submit form to create new activity, our handler function submit gets called, and right after we reset value of text field, we need to scroll the page to the bottom. So let's write the following statement. By using native DOM APIs, we're gonna call scroll_to method on window object. And as parameters to this method, we're passing coordinates. First parameter corresponds to x coordinate. That specifies how much we need to scroll page horizontally. In our case, we don't need to scroll horizontally, so let's specify 0. And the second argument here corresponds to y coordinate. And since we need to scroll the page to the very bottom, we need to know the height of the page's scroll area, which we can get by using scroll height property on the body object. And now supposedly, whenever we're gonna create new activity, we should see the page scroll to the bottom. But in fact, this does not happen. And here is why. Whenever Vue triggers submit event, our text field gets reset. And just because this activity variable is a reactive variable, Vue will automatically update those parts of the DOM that depend on this variable. But since this whole process of updating the DOM happens asynchronously, the new DOM node, which represents new activity item, has not been added to the DOM structure yet. So our instruction to scroll the page to the bottom happens first. But we have to execute this instruction only after new node will be added on the page. So we need to somehow wait until Vue will update DOM structure, and only then execute this instruction to scroll the page to the bottom. And for such cases, Vue provides us with another function called nextTick, which accepts closure, and everything that we're gonna pass inside of this closure will be executed only after the next re-render. So we can place our instruction to scroll the page within this closure. And this way we'll make sure that this line will be executed after Vue finishes updating the DOM. And now we need to import this nextTick function from the Vue package. Let's scroll up and add an import. And now let's test this whole thing. Let's create a couple of activities and make sure that the page gets scrolled to the bottom, which is exactly what is happening in here. So our scrolling behavior is working properly. And also let's take a look at a couple more notations, how this can be written. Since nextTick function returns promise, we can chain calls on this promise and call method called then. And when this promise gets resolved, it's gonna execute this closure which we passed to this then function. And by using this notation we will get the same result as before. Let's check it out in the browser. So we are seeing the same behavior after we create new activities. Pages scroll to the bottom. And one more notation that we can use while using nextTick function is to use keywords async and await. This way, by using await keyword, we wait until promise will be resolved, which in this case means when the DOM will be updated. And since await keyword should be used with another keyword async, let's specify this keyword in front of this function definition. And these are three different notations that basically do the same thing at the end. So special function nextTick can be used whenever we need to wait until Vue finishes updating the DOM. And after that, we can execute any other code. We will start this lesson with fixing one UI issue. When we remove activities from the activities list, activity creation form is shifted to the top, but it should always be fixed at the bottom, right on top of navigation. So how do we fix it? First of all, we're gonna open up component the activities. This is the component which renders our activities list. Here we're gonna find a wrapper element which wraps activities list, which is this div. We will make this div flexible container with main vertical axis. And to make this div occupy the whole available space within its parent, we're gonna assign class grow. So after doing all that, we don't actually see any noticeable changes. But since we made a wrapper container flexible container, we can also assign class grow to UL element, which will make this list stretch to the very bottom. And this way activity creation form will be always positioned at the bottom. So let's do just that. To this UL element we will assign class grow, and right away in the browser we see that the activity creation form was moved to its previous position. And now we're ready to get to the main topic of this lesson. So what we will do next is whenever we don't have any activities, instead of showing this empty page, would be good to show some image with text saying that there are no activities currently. And for that I have already added image called no activities in a project. So let's just create a folder called img inside of assets folder and move our images inside of this folder. First of all, let's move our new image no activities, and then let's also move our logo, logo.png. And now that we have moved logo, we need to go to the logo component and fix path to this logo right here by adding our new folder img. And at that place where we render list of activity item components based on activities array, first of all we have to check if this activity array is not empty, then we're gonna show this list. Let's add Vue directive in here and check if activities array is not empty. Only then we're gonna render this element. Otherwise, right under this div, we're gonna add another div with velse directive, inside of which we're gonna place an image. This image will appear only when there are no activities in the list. And let's specify correct path to our image, no activities. And just to see if the image will appear, let's remove all activity items and make sure that our new image is shown. And there we go, our new image appears. Let's just decrease height of this image by assigning class h48. And then let's add some description right at the bottom of this image, saying that you do not have any activities currently. And after that, let's just position this image with description in the center and stretch this container with an image so that it occupies all available space. Alright, firstly, let's position image in the center by making this container flexible container with main vertical axis, and position all elements within this container in the center by using class items_center, and distance between child elements will be 4 units, and padding from all sides will be 8 units. And finally, let's also assign class text_center to align text in the center. And finally, we have almost got the result that we need. Let's just make the color of this text a little brighter by assigning class text gray 400. And just like we did with our list, when we made it occupy all available space by assigning class grow to shift activity creation form to the bottom, we're gonna do the same with the following div. Let's also add a class grow. And there we go. Now we have all elements exactly where we need them to be. And now if there will be no activities in a list, right away we're gonna see that placeholder image with a little description. But when there is at least one activity, our image disappears and activity list is shown instead. And now that we have implemented main functionality, we can focus on refactoring. For example, this markup, which is responsible for showing placeholder image with description, is a perfect example to create separate component. So let's cut this markup and create component with a name, the activities empty state. Let's create new file within components folder with the same name, the activities empty state. Here we're gonna add tag template and paste our markup. And since we need to conditionally show this component, instead of using the else directive on the root element of this component, we need to move it and place it directly on top of the activity empty state component, like so. And the only thing that actually left to do is to import this component within current component. Let's write an import in here. And finally, let's go over all implemented functionality once again in a browser. So whenever there is at least one activity exists, we're gonna see activity list. But once I remove the last activity, instead of showing an empty list, we're gonna see a placeholder image with description, saying that there are no activities yet. And of course, in Vue DevTools, we can see the component which is responsible for showing this image. It is called the activities empty state. And right after I add new activity, this component disappears and activity list is shown again. And this way we have made a little improvement to user experience. So let's continue development in the next lesson. Activities is one of the main entities in our application. But so far we store all activities in a simple array called activities, which is declared inside of our root component. And every item in this array represents name of the activity. But soon we're going to need more information which will describe a particular activity. So we gotta represent every activity as an object with a couple of properties. And in this lesson we're going to change activity representation. So our array of activities will be array of objects. Let's go to app component, where currently that activities array is stored. So instead of hard-coding activities array in here, let's just use custom function with the name generateActivities, which is going to dynamically generate array of activities for us. And then let's go ahead and declare this function in our functions.js file. So in here, let's export new function with the name generateActivities, and its job will be to return array of activity objects. So for now, we're going to describe every activity by using 3 fields: ID, name, and seconds to complete. To generate random unique IDs for every activity, we're going to use another function with the name ID, which we'll declare soon. The next field will be name to store activity name. And finally, property seconds to complete is going to store amount of seconds we have chosen to spend on a particular activity in order to complete it. And then let's go ahead and copy this object and add a couple more activities in this array. So for the second activity, we're going to specify that we wish to spend on this activity 3600 seconds, which means 1 hour. And this activity we'll call training. And finally, for the third activity, we'll specify 2 hours for seconds to complete property. And this activity will be called reading. But to make it easier for us to see how many hours exactly we would like to spend on a particular activity, let's just rewrite values for seconds to complete properties in a little bit different form. We're gonna multiply amount of hours on amount of seconds in 1 hour. So basically in here we're converting hours into seconds. So for the first activity we will not specify any hours at all. So let's use 0. For the second activity, let's use 1 hour. And finally, for the last activity, we're gonna use 2 hours. And this way, by multiplying every hour by 3600 seconds, we are converting hours into seconds. And also, just to avoid repeating ourselves, let's create separate constant, which is going to represent amount of seconds in 1 hour. So in our constants.js module, let's create new constant with name seconds in hour. Every hour has 3600 seconds. And finally, let's use our new constant and replace this value. Let's do this in all 3 objects. So this new constant should also be imported from constants file. Let's write down this import in here. And just to make it more readable, let's place every constant on its own line. And since we have used custom function ID to generate random unique ID for every activity, we're gonna need to define this function. So right here, let's create another function with a name ID. And here I'm just going to write some code, which is going to let us generate random IDs. And in our case, these IDs will be represented by strings. So to generate these IDs, we will use current date converted to string, and then we're gonna append to this string another random number, also converted to string. And let's also trim first 2 characters out of this string by using native method called substring. So after doing all that, we have to go back to our app component and import our newly created function, generate activities. And then let's take a look what is happening to activities after we generate them by using generate activities function. So after array of activities is generated, we're gonna make it reactive array and save into activities constant. And then down here in our template, we're gonna pass this activities array into the activities component as activities prop. Inside of this component, we're going to iterate over every activity object from activities array and create activity item component where we're gonna pass individual activity object as another prop called activity. And finally, if we take a look inside of activity item component, we're gonna see that in here, we are just outputting name of the activity. But since we have changed representation of every activity, before it was a string, but now it's an object of this form, where name is stored under name property. So now in order to print activity name, we have to reference name property. And also inside of the activities component, where we were assigning value to key attribute. Before we were assigning activity name, but now since every activity has its own unique identifier, we're gonna use this identifier as a value for key attribute. Usually it is considered a good practice to use resource identifiers as values for key attributes when using Vue directive. And now there is one more function that we have to correct. Let's go back to functions.js. Here at the very end we have a function which generates options for activity select box. So right now into this closure, instead of activity name, will be passed the whole activity object. Let's call it activity. And then as a value for a label property, we're going to reference activity name, like so. And as for value property, let's just use activity identifier .id. And then in the browser, let's try to create new activity and see if new activity item will appear in the list. As we can see, it was added, but the name is empty. So let's figure out what is going on. Inside of our root component app.vue, there is a function which is called whenever we send activity creation form, called create activity. It receives new activity name that we need to add, but since right now every activity is represented as an object instead of a string, we're gonna have to accept activity name, and instead of pushing the string to the end of activities array, we're gonna push an object. In our case, every activity object is represented by 3 properties, ID, name, and seconds to complete. So we need to create new activity object, assign unique ID by using our ID function. The name for this activity will be received in the parameter from the activity creation form. And finally, as a default value for seconds to complete property, we're gonna use 0. And then before checking it in the browser, we also have to import ID function from functions module. So after that, let's check result in the browser. As we can see inside of Vue DevTools, activities array contains objects with 3 properties, ID, name, and seconds to complete. And whenever I'm gonna add new activity to the list, we're gonna see that the new object was just added to the end of activities array. So after doing all this refactoring, our activity creation form works as expected. And of course, if we're going to remove all activities, we're gonna end up with an empty activities array in the root component. So far, this part of our application works as expected. Let's continue development in the next lesson. After we have changed data structure to represent activities, in console we got several warnings related to validation. So in this lesson we're gonna get to fixing those warnings. And the first warning is related to base select component. Let's select this component in Vue DevTools. And if before every activity ID was represented by number, right now activity IDs are strings. So in order to fix this validation warning, we need to open up a function which is responsible to validate activity select options, which is this function validate select options. So let's see its definition. In here, this function calls another validator function isSelectOptionValid, which checks 2 fields, label and value of every activity select option object. Value variable here stores identifier of activity select option. So if before those identifiers were numbers, which is why we were using isNumber function to validate this value, but now identifiers are strings, let's use another function isNotEmptyString. So activity identifier should be either number or non-empty string. And just like that, we have fixed previous validation warning, but now we get another warning. And this warning is related to activities prop of the activities component. And here we basically have the same problem. And to fix it, we need to open up the activities component, find validation rule which validates activities property. And within this validation function, validate activities, we're calling another function isActivityValid. And since before all activities were just represented by simple strings, right now instead of activity name, this function accepts an object with 3 properties. So every activity object consists of 3 properties, ID, name, and seconds to complete. We can destructure those properties in here. And then we need to manually apply validation to every property. So to validate identifier, we're gonna use isNotEmptyString function. For property name, we can use the same validation, isNotEmptyString. And finally, seconds to complete property should be a number, so we can check it by using isNumber function. And in order for activity object to be valid, all these 3 validations should pass. And we can check it like so. Let's wrap these 3 function calls within an array. And then if all these function calls will return true, it will mean that all validation rules were passed. And to verify that every item in this array is true, we can by using every method and by passing boolean constructor into this method. And this way we have fixed previous validation warning. Let's go to the next one. This one is related to activity item component, specifically to activity property. This is because previously this property were accepting string values, but now we need to modify definition of this property inside of activity item component and change property type on object. So we simply go inside of activity item component, and in here instead of a string, we're gonna use object. And eventually we'll end up with an empty console, so all validation warnings were successfully fixed. But now just to make sure, let's go back to functions.js file and make it so that one of these validation rules will fail. For example, let's specify a wrong data type for seconds to complete property of an activity object. So in the function which generates activity objects, which is this generate activities function, let's change value for seconds to complete property and use string. And just like we expected, we got validation warning saying that custom validation check failed for prop activities. So that means our current validation rules protect us from wrong data types passed into component props. And finally in the browser, let's try to remove all activities, then add a couple of new ones. And in this case, we see that we still get some validation warnings. So this warning pops up after we send activity creation form within the activity form component. And specifically whenever we send a submit event to parent component, because this data that we send along with this event is still a string. But since at our current stage of project development every activity is represented by an object, we're gonna have to change a bit activity creation process, which we will do in upcoming lessons. In this lesson, we're gonna do some refactoring and specifically improve activity generation process. But before that, let's fix that validation issue which happens after we create new activity. So if this is happening when we create new activity, we need to open up component which is responsible for activity creation. It's the activity form component. And in here, when we send this form, we fire custom event submit to parent component. And along with this event, we send a new activity name. But since now our activities are represented by objects instead of strings, we need to tweak activity creation process a bit, and instead of passing simple string with this submit event, we need to create an activity object with properties ID, name, and seconds to complete, and pass this whole object to parent component. So for generating ID, we're gonna use ID function. The name which user specifies in the text field is stored within activity reactive variable. And by default, all newly created activities will have value 0 for seconds to complete property. So let's just import ID function from functions module and rename activity variable on something more specific, because this variable stores only activity name, but not the whole activity object. We'll call this variable name and rename it wherever needed. And a couple more occurrences of this variable we also have in template. Let's rename it in here. So now once user will submit activity creation form, we'll fire submit event and pass activity object to parent component. The parent component already has a listener registered to handle this submit event. And then this listener will pass newly created activity object along with create activity event to our root component. So that root component can appropriately handle this event, which it does by using create activity handler function. And all this function is doing is adding new activity to the end of the activities array. But now, since we passed the whole activity object instead of just a simple string, we're gonna get this object within activity parameter and pass this object to push method to add it to activities array. So we don't need to manually create this activity object again in here. And this way ID function is no longer used in this component. Let's remove this import. And then I'm gonna go and add new activity. Then remove all activities from this list, just to make sure that those actions will not produce any validation warnings. And as we can see, console remains empty, so all our data is valid. And at the end of this lesson, let's just go ahead and refactor generate activities function within functions.js file. This function is used to create initial list of activities that we show on activities page. And in order to not repeat ourselves, we're gonna rewrite all this in a little bit different way. So for example, what we can do in here is to declare array of strings, which would be activity names like so, and then map over every activity name and create activity object, which will consist of 3 fields, ID, name, and seconds to complete. So the name of the activity we're gonna receive in the first parameter name, which we use in here. And as a second parameter to this closure, we receive an activity name index from this array. And we can use this hours variable in this expression to calculate value for seconds to complete property. And now we have basically rewritten everything that was written in here in more concise form. So let's remove this whole chunk of code right now. And in Vue DevTools, we see that the array of activities is represented by activity objects. Each of those contains 3 fields, ID, name, and seconds to complete, just like before. And by removing or adding new activities, we can see that this activities array gets updated and new activity objects are pushed to the end of this array. So we are in a pretty good state to continue development in the next lesson. Right now, all the options of this select box do not depend on array of activities stored with an activities constant, which means if I'm gonna go ahead and add one more activity to this list, the new object will be added to activities array, as we can see in here. But if we take a look again at that list of options, we still see here 3 initial activities. So our newly created activity does not show up in here. And to fix it, we're gonna need to somehow relate activity select options array with activities array, so that select box options will be updated anytime we're gonna add or remove activities. And right now, array of options for this select box is generated by using generateActivitySelect options function within app component. And right here we see that we also pass array of activities to generate array of options. But whenever this reactive array of activities will change, we need to call this function generateActivitySelect options again. So we already know to make one data dependent on another, we can use special function computed and wrap that part of code that should be reevaluated anytime one of the reactive variables will change into such closure that we pass to computed function. And this way, whenever we're gonna add or remove activities from activities array, this callback function will be triggered again, and this way we're going to regenerate ActivitySelect options based on new activities array. So firstly, let's import computed function from the Vue package and try all this out in the browser. So initially this list contains 3 activities, but when I'm gonna add new one, right away we'll see that our newly added activity will appear in this list. And this way we made ActivitySelect options array dependent on activities array. So let's continue and open up component activity item. Right here we have one local constant called seconds to complete. And this constant holds value for the select box on activities page. Let's open up this activities page in the browser, and in Vue DevTools, select activity item component. Right here we can see that every activity item object that gets passed within this component as a prop activity has property seconds to complete with initial value of 0. So this is the value that should be used as initial value for all select boxes on this page. But instead what we have right now is we have declared separate constant seconds to complete. And this is exactly that constant which is used to pre-select values within select boxes. So first of all, let's just change initial value for this constant to 0. And after that, all select boxes on this page will show first pre-selected option with value 15. And what we will potentially need to do is to bind values of seconds to complete properties of objects stored within activities array in root component to every select box on activities page. But right now these values are stored in seconds. And if we take a look at the array which is used to render select box options, which is this period select options array within activity item component, right here we can see that the value property is stored as minutes. So first of all, let's just convert minutes to seconds. For this, let's go to constants.js file, and in here we're gonna multiply every value of value property by 60 to convert minutes to seconds. After that, let's open up base select component, and let's see what happens whenever we select value in this select element. So after we select the value, this handler gets called, which will fire custom event select to parent component. And along with this event, it's going to pass value which was selected. And right here we also convert this value to a number by using this plus sign. And here is the problem. On timeline page, all these select boxes have string values, because they allow us to pick particular activity. And as a selected value, activity ID is used, which is not a number, but a string. So after we're gonna select value in one of these select boxes, we're gonna see that selected activity ID constant has invalid value, which is not a number. And this happens because we try to convert activity identifier, which is a string, to a number by using that plus sign. And let's just change implementation of base select components in a way that it will accept selected prop not only as a number but also as string. We can do this by using the following notation. Let's assign an array of types to selected property in here. So in this case we allow only string values and number values. And then just to clean up the template a little bit, let's just move this handler within separate function. We're gonna call this handler select and pass selected value, which can be accessed in the template by using event object, like so. And then let's scroll up and create new function with the name select, which will accept one parameter called value. This will be the value which was selected in the select box, and then we're going to fire event with the name select and pass selected value to the parent component. And also in that place where we reset value by clicking on the button next to select box, we're also going to use our new handler select and pass in here null, because we need to send null to parent component in cases when the value will be reset. And before sending that value to parent component, we're going to apply some normalization. We will create separate function for that with the name normalize select value. And within functions.js file, right above generate activities function, we're going to export new function with the name normalize select value with one parameter. And here we're basically going to check the value. And if this value will be null, which we can check by using isNull function, or this value will be a string which cannot be converted to a number. In such cases, we're not gonna apply any casting and return this value as is. But when this value is a numeric string which can be converted to a number, we're going to convert this value to a number, as before, by using plus sign. And since we have used custom function is null, we need to import it first. Let's go up and import function is null from validators module. And of course, in order to use our new function normalize select value in base select component, we also have to import it. Let's write an import for this function in base select component. And just because right now isNull validator is private function, we need to export this function. And then let's group all public functions within this file in one place. After that, let's switch over to browser, and we notice that all select boxes by default have first activity selected. But in fact, that variable which is used as initial value for those select boxes has null value, so this is not correct. Because in this case, those select boxes should show default option as selected. We will take care about it later. And for now, let's try to reset value of this select box. And in this case, everything is correct. Selected activity ID constant has null value, and select box shows default option with a text rest. And if I'm going to select any other activity, I'm gonna get activity ID within this variable. And then let's also check how select boxes behave on activities page. First of all, I'm going to select activity item component within Vue DevTools. That variable which is used as initial value for those select boxes is called seconds to complete, which currently has value null. And when I select any other option in this variable, I will get respective value. And sure enough, if I'm going to reset value, I'm gonna get null value again. And select box shows default option as selected. So right now let's try to fix initial value of select boxes on timeline page. Because when there is no value within this selected activity ID variable, all these select boxes should display default option as selected. It's actually very easy to do. We just have to go inside of timeline item component, and where we have declared selected activity ID reactive variable as initial value, we should specify null. But for all those select boxes that are located on activities page, we're going to use 0 as initial value. So as we can see, right now all select boxes show default option selected with a text rest. But once I start picking activities, right away in the console, I'm gonna get warning. This warning is related to select event, which is fired from base select component. So let's go inside of that component and check which validation function is used for select event. So the function is number or null. But now we also need to allow string values, so we're going to create another function to validate this event with the name isSelectValueValid. Let's scroll up and import this new function and remove import for isNumber or null function. And then within validators.js file, we're going to create an export function with the name isSelectValueValid, which will accept one parameter. And since we'll have to check that the selected value should be non-empty string, let's use another validator function for it called isNotEmptyString. And additionally, selected value can also be number or null, which we're gonna check by using isNumber or null function. And finally, we can pick any activity in this select box, then reset this value, and we're not gonna get any validation warnings anymore. So select boxes on this page work as expected. Whenever we pick any value in this select box, selected activity ID variable will be populated with activity ID that we've just selected by using this select box. And we will also check other select boxes on activities page. Let's pick first activity item component in Vue DevTools. And here we still have one little problem with this select box. The thing is that seconds to complete variable holds value 0. And this variable is used as initial value for select box. But select box, as we can see, has another option selected. So this is not correct, and we're going to fix it in upcoming lessons. And when we will try to select different value, we will get correct behavior, and seconds to complete variable is updated. Same thing goes when we try to reset the value. Seconds to complete variable in this case receives value null. And let's also open up console and make sure that there are no validation warnings when we try to remove activities. We don't see any validation warnings, but in fact on the first page we have a strange behavior. After removing activity, first select box shows empty value. We're going to fix this inconsistency later on, and for now let's finish this lesson. These select boxes on timeline page are used to select specific activity for every hour, and every hour in our application is represented by timeline item object. But whenever we select value by using this select box, we are not modifying any properties of that timeline item object, but instead separate local variable called selected activity ID within timeline item component gets modified and assigned a value of the selected activity. And now we're going to add one more property to timeline item objects that are stored within timeline items array of the app component to store ID of specific activity selected by using those select boxes. And this way we will connect selected activity to every hour. So let's start with adding one more property to timeline item objects. We generate timeline items array by using generate timeline items function. And right here for now we have only one property, hour. We're going to add another property called activity ID with initial value of null. And then just to connect this value to those select boxes on timeline page, we need to pass value of this property activity ID within selected prop of base select component. And this way we make those select boxes be dependent on selected activity property of every timeline item object. And now that local variable which was used to store selected value of this select box is no longer needed, we can remove it. And what we see right now in Vue DevTools is that every object within timeline items array has additional property activity ID with an initial value of null. And we already know that those objects will get passed to every timeline item component as timeline item prop. And the next step would be to update activity ID property with selected activity ID whenever user chooses particular activity by using this select box. And to do that, we will need to modify handler of select event, which comes from base select component. We're going to use separate function with the name select activity. So after this event is received, it will get passed ID of selected activity. Within this handler, we're going to receive ID of selected activity, which comes from base select component. And then we'll notify parent component by sending custom event with the name select activity. And to let parent component know which activity was chosen, we will need to find activity in here by using ID and pass it along with this event. And before proceeding further, let's declare macro define emits. In here we'll add one custom event, select activity, and validation function for this event will be is activity valid. Then let's scroll up and import all necessary functions and remove import of ref function. And now let's determine how we will search for activity objects by using ID. Let's assume that in this component we have access to array of activities. Then we can use native array method find to find particular object of this array. So this method allows us to search for elements by particular condition. And since we're searching for activities by their IDs, we're going to compare ID of current activity with that ID we received as a parameter to this function. But of course, currently we don't have access to activities array from within this component, so we need to accept it from outside. Let's declare one more prop with the name activities. This property is going to be required. Type will be array, and validation function will be validate activities. And as always, let's scroll up and import all necessary functions. And also let's format this import a little bit by placing every imported function on its own line for better readability. And as a next step, we're gonna have to pass that activities array declared in the root component within timeline item component. So first of all, from the app component, we're going to pass this array to the timeline component as activities prop. Within the timeline component, we also have to declare this prop. Let's copy our declaration of this prop from timeline item component and move it to the timeline component. In here, we also have to import validate activities function. Let's do so right here. And finally, by having access to this array within the timeline component, we can easily pass this array further to every timeline item component as activities prop. And after doing all that, let's see what we got in Vue Developer Tools. So in the root component, we have activities array. It is the component where this array was initially declared. And then we're passing this array as activities prop to the timeline component. And after that, every timeline item component will also receive this array as activities prop. So right now, after choosing value in this select box, we will be able to find activity by its ID, since now we have access to activities array from within timeline item component. And then we're going to fire custom events back to app component so that this app component can properly update timeline item object with the activity ID that was just chosen for that particular hour. And in terms of code, it's gonna look like this. After choosing value in that select box, firstly the select activity handler gets called, where we're going to find the activity object by the received ID, and then this whole activity object gets passed to parent component along with select activity event. But here we need to reference activities array by using props object, since activities is one of the props in this component. And after this event is received by this component, we're gonna have to send another custom event. For example, we'll call this event set timeline item activity. And this way we're gonna let root component know which activity should be assigned to a particular hour. That hour is represented by timeline item object, so we're gonna pass this object as a payload, as well as object of currently selected activity in that select box. And that object is received in this handler as event payload within special event variable. And before registering handler for this event in parent component, first of all, let's just use define emits macro to declare all necessary custom events. We have only one event with the name set timeline item activity, which is going to receive object with two properties, timeline item and activity. We're gonna destructure these properties in here and write validation for every property. So checking if timeline item object is valid, we're going to by using isTimelineItemValid function. And as for activity object, we'll check it by using another validation function called isActivityValid. And as we can see, it's pretty convenient to initially declare all necessary validation function and then reuse them whenever we need to. And finally, to verify that both of these functions will return true, we're gonna wrap these calls in array and call method every on this array, passing boolean constructor. And finally, let's go inside of parent component, which is root component app. And here we're going to declare listener for set timeline item activity event. And to handle this event, let's use separate function with the same name, set timeline item activity. And all this function will have to do is to assign activity ID to activity ID prop of timeline item object. So let's destructure two properties that we receive from child component, timeline item and activity object. And then let's write statement which will assign activity ID to activity ID property of timeline item object. And that's it. This is how we assign particular activity to every hour. Before checking this out in a browser, let's go back to the timeline component and import all necessary validation functions, such as isTimelineItemValid and isActivityValid. We also need to store all defined properties within timeline item component in props constant, since we use this constant in this component. And now let's see what happens when we will select value in this select box. Let's watch timeline item object and specifically activity ID property. And just like that, this property gets updated and assigned selected activity ID. And of course, since we do modification of this property within app component, first timeline item object in timeline items array of parent component was also modified. Because technically this is the same object, which then gets passed to all necessary components down the component tree. Firstly, this array of timeline items objects gets passed to the timeline component, and then every object from this array gets passed to individual timeline item components as timeline item prop. And of course, all those select boxes on this page are completely independent from each other. And if we're gonna select activity by using second select box, then it will affect second timeline item object from timeline items array, and selected activity ID will be assigned to activity ID property of the second object, as we can see right here. And the reason why we had to do this modification of timeline item object by assigning selected activity ID to activity ID property directly in root component instead of, for example, in the timeline component is because timeline items array is declared within root component, and doing data modifications that get passed to other components as prop directly in those components is not a good practice. So that's why we had to fire custom events all the way back to root component so it could properly update this array. So right now there is only one problem which happens when we try to reset value of this select box. And we can see that the error message related to this problem pops up in the console. We're going to fix this problem in the next lesson. After we select activity for a particular hour by using these select boxes, we already know that it's going to update activity ID property of timeline item objects that are initially declared within timeline items array of the root component. But now let's see what happens when we're going to remove one of the selected activities. So for example, let's try to remove coding activity. Let's go to activities page and remove first activity. And then switch back to timeline page, and the first select box shows reading activity as selected instead of coding. So the removed coding activity disappeared. But in fact, in Vue DevTools, within timeline items array, activity ID property of the first object still contains ID of the deleted activity. So we actually have to remove such activity IDs that were being deleted. Inside of timeline item component, when we select activity, it's gonna call select activity handler, and then it will fire custom event select activity to the timeline component. And when the timeline component will receive this event, it will fire another event with the name set timeline item activity to parent component, which is our root component. And in this handler set timeline item activity, we're going to assign ID of the selected activity to activity ID property of timeline item object. And when we try to remove some activity, delete activity handler gets called. So in this handler, besides removing activity from the activities array, we also have to go over all items within timeline items array by using for each loop. And within this closure, we're going to check if activities ID we're currently trying to remove is contained within one of the activity ID properties of timeline item object. In this case, we're going to reset activity ID since this activity will be removed. And there is no point to store IDs of deleted activities. So we're just going to do simple assignment of null value to this activity ID property, like so. And finally, let's test it out in the browser. So currently, first two objects of timeline items array have activity ID properties set to null. And now let's try to pick some activities for these 2 hours. For the first one, we'll choose coding, and for the second one, reading. And corresponding IDs were just assigned to activity ID properties of corresponding objects. And now, after removing one of these activities, for example, coding activity, if we take a look at the timeline page, we will see that the first select box still shows wrong activity, because after activity removal, all those select boxes that had removed activity as selected before should reset their values and show option by default. So in terms of UI, it's still not working as expected yet. But at least in Vue DevTools, activity ID property of the first timeline item object got null value. So from the data point of view, reset functionality works. And whenever we remove certain activities, if those activities were selected on the timeline page, their IDs will get reset within timeline item objects after activity removal. And we will be improving this behavior in the next lessons. We will start this lesson with fixing a bug which happens when we try to reset activity. In other words, when we are assigning value null to activity ID property of timeline item object. So let's try it out. I'll click on the reset button, and in the console we'll see the following error, which is happening when calling isActivityValid method. And to fix it, we have to go to timeline item component And here within select activity event handler, which is called anytime we select new value in activity select box. And within this handler, we're trying to find activity by its ID that we have received as a parameter to this function. But anytime we reset value of the select box, this ID parameter will contain value null, so that this expression is not going to return an activity object. And in those cases, we have to fall back and return null instead, like so. And after that, we also have to modify validator for select activity event. So this validator is going to accept activity object in activity parameter. And since activity object can be null, anytime we reset value of the select box, we're going to use validator is null to allow for this value. Or in all other cases, we're going to check that the activity object will be valid by using isActivityValid validator. So now let's import isNullValidator in this component from validators module. And then we're gonna have to adjust validation logic within the timeline component as well. In this method, we also use isActivityValidValidator, but since now we allow for null values as well, we're going to add a code to isNullValidator just like before, passing activity object in here. And here is the same thing, we also have to import isNullValidator into this component. And now in the browser, let's see what happens when we try to reset the value of the first select box. And this time we got error. And this is due to that same fact that whenever we reset value of the select box, it is going to trigger select activity handler within the timeline component, which in turn is going to trigger another event with the name setTimelineItemActivity to parent component, which in our case is root component. And finally, if we're going to take a look at the handler setTimelineItemActivity inside of the root component, this is exactly the function which gets triggered when we try to reset value of the select box. And while resetting the value, activity object is going to be null, so this reference to ID property will fail since activity variable is null. So we have to prevent this from happening, and we can do so by using optional chaining operator. And this way we check if activity variable will be null, we're going to fall back null value, like so, by using OR operator. And this value will be assigned to activity ID property of timeline item object. And let's do one more check in the browser. First of all, we're going to select two values by using two select boxes. And at the same time, within timeline items array, selected activity IDs have been assigned to activity ID properties of corresponding objects. And when we try to reset the value of the first select box, right after we will see that null value has been assigned to this activity ID property. So in terms of data, everything looks good, but in fact in the UI, we can see that the first select box shows wrong activity as selected, because after we reset the value, it should show default option. And now let's find out why our UI is not updated properly. So the problem is this: when we reset activity for a particular hour, we are going to assign null value to activity ID property of corresponding timeline item object. But the thing is that this timeline item object belongs to an array which is not reactive, and Vue does not monitor any changes that are being made to properties of these objects. So all we have to do is make this array reactive by using ref function, like so. And now any modifications to objects that are stored within timeline items reactive array will be monitored by Vue, and Vue can properly update our interface based on new values of properties within those timeline items objects. And in those places where we reference timeline items array, now we need to get access to a reactive array by using value property, since this variable is now reactive. So let's add the value property right here and check everything in the browser. Once again, we'll start our testing with selecting two values by using two first select boxes. And let's make sure that the appropriate selected activity IDs were assigned to activity ID properties of timeline items objects. And now, for example, if I try to remove one of the selected activities, for example, coding activity, let's go to activities page and remove the first activity, which is coding. Then right away on timeline page, I will see that the first select box shows default option instead of coding activity, because earlier coding activity was removed. And of course, activity ID property stores value null. So now functionality for resetting select box values works as expected. Link to the source code of this project will be in the video description. Now it's time to bind values of the select boxes to every activity object. And we know that all activity objects are stored within activities array that is passed as one of the props to the activities component. And then every object from this array gets passed to activity item component. And as we can see, every activity object stores 3 fields. And one of these fields is seconds to complete property, which should be used as a value for those select boxes. So this value will be passed to base select component. And then once base select component will trigger a select event back to activity item component, this activity item will fire another event to its parent component, and so on, back to the root component, which will update property seconds to complete of the corresponding activity object. So now let's open up activity item component, and this constant seconds to complete, which is currently used as an initial value for the select box, is no longer needed here. So let's remove this constant, and instead we're going to bind the value of the seconds to complete property of the activity object to selected prop of base select component. And then when selected value will be changed, this base select component will fire select event. And here we already have a listener registered to handle this event. And we could as easily assign a new selected value to seconds to complete property, like this. But we already know that modifying props of components is bad practice. So we only have to modify data in those components where this data is initially declared. And to do this, we need to fire custom event back to parent component. Let's name this event set seconds to complete. And along with this event, we will pass selected value, which we can retrieve by using event variable here. And then let's scroll up to define emits macro and declare new event set seconds to complete. And the validation function will be isNumber, because all values that can be selected by using those select boxes are numbers. And then let's import isNumber function from validators module and remove unused ref function. And of course, after firing custom event from this component, we need to set up a listener in the parent component. So let's switch over to parent component, the activities, and in here, register new listener for set seconds to complete event. We are going to handle this event by using another local function with the same name, which will accept activity, for which we are selecting value by using that select box. And we can get this activity object by using activity loop variable in here. And as a second argument, let's pass selected value, which, as always, we can grab by using special event variable. And then let's define this new function, set seconds to complete, with 2 parameters, activity and seconds to complete, which is going to fire another custom event. We will call this event set activity seconds to complete, which we will send back to parent component. And parent component in this case is our root component, which should know the activity object for which we're selecting seconds to complete, as well as actual seconds to complete value. So we are going to pass these both pieces of data as separate parameters in here. And before registering listener for this event in a parent component, first of all, let's define validation for this event. So let's define validation function for this event within define emits macro. And since we are passing 2 values with this event, we need to declare 2 parameters and validate every parameter within this function. So firstly, we're gonna validate activity object by using isActivityValid validator function. And another parameter, seconds to complete, should be a number, which we can check by using isNumber function. And then in order for this event to be valid, we need that both of these functions will return true. And we can check that both of these functions will return true by using every method, like so. And after that, we are ready to go to root component, register new listener for set activity seconds to complete event, and we are going to create separate handler function for this event. So in here, let's create that new function, which is going to accept 2 parameters. One of them is activity and another one seconds to complete. So all we have to do within this function is to assign seconds to complete value to the corresponding property of the activity object, like so. And this way we are updating current activity object with the value of seconds that was previously chosen in the select box. But now let's just quickly switch over to validators.js file and export validation function is number, because now we're using this function outside of this module. And then let's group all functions that we export in one place. But there is actually another inconsistency with this select box. And the thing is that we store seconds to complete values within activity objects as seconds. But select boxes themselves use values in minutes. So first of all, what we should do is to make both of these values use the same representation. And to do that, we're gonna have to modify value properties within period select options constant. If before we were using minutes in here, right now we're gonna use seconds. And let's just do it in the following format. We're going to multiply amount of hours by amount of seconds in 1 hour. And this way, we're converting hours into seconds. So first option will correspond to 1 hour, second option will correspond to 2 hours, and so on. Third option will contain 3 hours. And with that, we should also modify labels so that they show correct values. And right now what we see in the browser is that the first select box shows wrong option as selected, because in the first activity object, property seconds to complete stores value 0. And in such cases, select box should show default option as selected. But regarding other two select boxes, they show correct values. Second objects store values of seconds in 1 hour, and the third option stores values of seconds in 2 hours. And we see that corresponding options were selected in the second and third select boxes. And of course, the constant period select options that stores options for select boxes now has value property in seconds in every object. So now we're going to figure out what is wrong with first select box so that it doesn't show correct option. And before that, let's go back to constant.js and modify values of labels. Let's use leading 0 to always represent hour by using 2 digits. So the problem with the first select box is this. In the activity item component, when we pass value to selected prop of base select component, we are referencing seconds to complete property of activity object. But the base select component will show default option only in cases when we're gonna pass null within selected property. So whenever our activity object stores 0 within seconds to complete property, we're not going to pass 0, but instead we will fall back to null, like so. So that base select component can properly show option by default. And now in the browser we can see that the first select box shows default option, and seconds to complete property of activity object has value of 0. And now it works as expected. So we can continue. Now let's try to reset value of one select box. And right away in a console we're gonna get warning related to validation, saying that event validation failed for event with the name set seconds to complete. And this is happening because when we reset value of the select box, this event variable will store value of null. But as a validation for this event, we use function isNumber, which will allow only numbers to be passed along with this event to parent component. So we're going to provide simple fallback, and whenever event variable will be null, we're going to pass value 0 instead. And this way our validation will be successfully passed. So now, before checking it in the browser, let's go back to the activities component and fix typo in this event. Let's add missing letter T in here, and also import isNumber function from validators module up here. And finally, let's go over all this functionality once again. I'm going to choose first activity item component within Vue Developer Tools. As we can see, seconds to complete property stores value 0 initially, and hence first select box shows default option. And when I'm going to pick another value right away, I'm gonna get another value assigned to this seconds to complete property that corresponds to the option that I have just chosen. And of course, this property will also be updated in activity objects inside of activities array, as we can see in here, within app component, because anytime we select new value in the select box, we are firing custom events to root component, so it can properly update our activity objects. And the same thing happens when we try to reset the value. In this case, we see 0 was assigned. So functionality to update seconds to complete property works as expected. Let's stop for a moment and do a little refactoring. So when we are choosing activity by using the select box, we're gonna fire custom events to parent component so it can properly update timeline item object and assign ID of selected activity to this activity ID property. And one of the events that gets sent to root component is called set timeline item activity within the timeline component. And along with this event, we also send two additional objects. One of them is timeline item object, for which we should update activity, and another object is activity itself. But instead of doing all this in one object, we can also pass separate parameters. Like so, second parameter will be timeline item object, and the third parameter will be activity object. That of course we receive as a payload from child component as event variable. And of course, after doing this change, we also have to tweak set timeline item activity validation function. Because now we're passing two separate parameters, so let's change the declaration in here and specify two separate arguments, timeline item and activity. And of course, the event handler function within root component app.vue, which is going to handle this event, set timeline item activity. Now this function is also going to receive two separate arguments. So let's modify function declaration properly. And now, just to make sure that we haven't broken anything after doing all this refactoring, let's do one run in the browser. So firstly, we're choosing activity. And after that, activity ID property should receive activity identifier, which we can see right here. And of course, proper timeline item object within timeline items array of root component was also updated. Because technically this is the same timeline item object that gets passed as a prop to all timeline item components. And when we are resetting value of the select box, we'll see that this property will be assigned null value. So now let's continue doing our refactoring and switch over to timeline item component. As a reminder, when we select activity by using that select box, the first thing that gets executed is this select activity handler function, which receives ID of selected activity. So in the browser, when we choose activity, we see right away that activity ID property was assigned activity identifier, and after resetting value of this select box, activity ID property receives null value. So when we select activity within that select box, this part of expression will return activity object that is found by ID. Otherwise, when we reset activity, this expression will return undefined, and we're gonna fall back to null. And just because of that, if we take a look at select activity validation function, it does not really make much logical sense. Because here, in order to validate activity, we're using two different validation functions. First of all, we are verifying if activity variable is null, and also here we are verifying that activity variable is indeed valid activity object. And in my opinion, it will be much better if these two checks can be executed within one function. So we're going to move isNullCheck within isActivityValidValidation function within validators.js. And as a first statement of this function, we're checking if activity variable is null. In this case, we assume that activity will be valid, so we're returning true. But since there is no activity variable in here, we have to check ID property. So when it's null, we will assume that activity is valid. And then we're going to create so-called null activity object, which will represent empty activity, where ID property will be null. And instead of returning null value in here, we're going to return this nullable activity object, which will also allow us to get rid of some additional checks within app component. Specifically within this setTimelineItemActivity function, because activity variable will always contain valid activity object, which will always have ID property. So there is no need to use this optional chaining operator in here anymore, and also fall back to null value. We could just easily rewrite this in the following form, by using normal assignment without any additional null checks. So to make it possible right here, we no longer can return simple null value. Instead, we're going to return nullable object, which is going to represent empty activity. And after that, let's switch over to constants.js and declare this new constant, nullable activity. It is going to be a simple object with only one property, ID, with the value of null. And this will be a shape of our nullable activity object. And now just to follow separation of concerns principle in our functions, we're going to extract this logic, which is looking for activity object by its ID, in a separate function, which we're gonna call findActivity by ID, passing ID of the activity we're looking for. So down here, let's create new function with the name findActivity by ID, paste in here all the code we just cut. Let's not forget and also declare one parameter, ID, and now that validation function for selectActivity event can be drastically simplified. And since now isNullCheck is being done within isActivityValid function, instead of using all these rules, we can simply use isActivityValid function. And now all the checks related to validating activity, they are consolidated within isActivityValid function. So there is no need to import isNull function within timelineItem component. Let's remove this import and instead import our new nullable activity object that we have just added to constants module. So now once selectActivity event is fired and sent to parent component, in the parent component we can see that when this event gets received, we're going to fire another custom event setTimelineItemActivity back to the root component. And as one of the rules to validate payload of this event, we have used isNull function. So there is no need to do it anymore, because isNullCheck is already contained within isActivityValid function. So we can simply remove it from here. Along with that, we're also removing isNull function import from here. And finally, we can go back to app component and remove this commented line, because now this function will always receive activity object as activity parameter that will always contain ID property. And this ID property will be either number or null. So now it's enough to do just basic assignment without any additional checks. Let's switch back to the browser and try to select activity by using first select box. And after doing that, in the console we can see that we receive an error, which is happening within isActivityValid function. So let's figure out what is going on in here. Go back to timelineItem component, and that error actually happens because our findActivity by ID function does not return anything. That is simply because I have missed return keyword in here. Let's add it and check everything again. As we can see now, after I select activity, we're gonna get activity ID assigned to activity ID property of timelineItem object, which is of course reflected in the original timelineItem object within parent component. And then of course every object from this timelineItems array gets sent as a prop to every timelineItem component. And when we're going to reset value of the select box, activity ID property of the particular timelineItem object will receive null value. And of course it was also reflected in original timelineItem object within timelineItems array of the root component. So after doing all this refactoring, we have made the process of selecting activity for a particular hour a little more intuitive. Link to the source code of this project will be in the video description. At the moment there are only 3 options available to us for choosing amount of time for a particular activity. And all these options are currently hard-coded, and they are assigned to period select options constant. Let's open up the file where this array of options is defined. It is constants.js file. And right here we can see that array of options assigned to period select options constant. So instead of doing all this manually, let's generate this list of options dynamically by using another function with the name generate period select options. So for the time being, we're gonna comment out these existing options right here. And let's scroll up and import our new function generate period select options from functions module. Next, let's go to functions.js, and here at the very bottom, we're going to export our new function generate period select options, which is going to help us generate select options for select boxes on activities page. And the first thing we're gonna do in here is declare period in minutes array, based on which we're going to generate period select options. I'm going to paste in here already prepared array of data, and every item of this array corresponds to amount of minutes for every select option. And then we're gonna loop over this array of minutes by using map method. And as a first parameter to this closure that we're passing to map method, we're going to receive amount of minutes from the array declared above. And for every entry, we need to generate new object, which will represent individual select option object. And this object should have two fields, value and label. So let's go ahead and add these two fields within this object, value and label. And as a value for value property, we're going to calculate the following expression. Amount of minutes will be multiplied by the constant seconds in minute, which is basically going to convert amount of minutes in seconds, since we'll have to store time spent on a particular activity in seconds. And as for the label property, for this, we're going to use another function, which we'll declare soon, generate period select options label. This will be a function that, based on amount of minutes, will generate appropriate label for the select option. So right here at the bottom, we're going to declare another function, generate period select options label, which will receive one parameter. And this parameter is gonna hold amount of minutes for which we will generate the label. And we're gonna represent every label in the following form. It will consist of amount of hours, colon, followed by amount of minutes. And now we're gonna have to calculate values for both of these properties. Firstly, let's do it for hours. We're gonna declare new constant hours right here. And firstly, let's use floor function to round the value, which we will specify right here. And the value we need will be derived out of the following expression. Let's divide period in minutes value by amount of minutes in 1 hour. And this way, we will find out how many hours is contained in amount of minutes stored in period in minutes parameter. And then received value we're going to convert to string. And eventually, since we need to represent every hour by using 2 digits, we're gonna make sure to add leading 0 to the hour we get after calculating this expression. And we can add leading 0 by using petStart method. We'll say that the resulting string should always have 2 characters. And in cases where there will be less characters, we're gonna add leading 0, like so. And then almost the same thing we're gonna apply for calculating amount of minutes. Let's declare another constant minutes and calculate the following expression. We need to get remainder of minutes, which is left in period in minutes parameter, after extracting full hours at the first step. So here we use division with a remainder and divide this value by minutes in hour constant. So here we need to get remainder of the division of period in minutes parameter by minutes in hour constant. And then this value we're gonna convert to string, and just like hours, we will represent minutes by using 2 digits. So let's also use petStart method to add a leading 0 in front of amount of minutes, in case received amount of minutes will consist of 1 digit. And this way we will make sure that the amount of minutes will be always represented by using 2 digits. And now let's scroll up to the very top and import all necessary constants, such as minutes in hour and seconds in minute. But we don't even have those constants declared yet, so let's go to constants.js and add 2 new constants. First constant will be called seconds in minute with the value 60, and the second constant will be minutes in hour, also with the value 60. And then we can also dynamically derive value for seconds in hour constant by multiplying seconds in minute constant by minutes an hour, like so, which is going to make our code a little bit more flexible. And eventually we can remove that initial array of period select options that we have previously commented out in here. So let's completely get rid of it. And before checking everything in the browser, let's do a little refactoring. Let's go back to functions.js. And here, where we are mapping over periods in minutes array, we can make this notation shorter by returning value from this closure directly, like so. So now, based on this initial array of amount of minutes, this function is going to generate for us array of select option objects that can be used to render select options for select box on activities page. And then generated array of select options objects will be assigned to period select options constant. And since this constant is already used as a prop value for the options prop, for base select component, that newly generated array of options will be rendered inside of select box. And now if we select activity item components in Vue DevTools, on the right side we can see that now period select options array contains 18 entries dynamically generated. And sure thing, all these array of options will be visible in this select box. As we can see now, there are a lot more options than before. And just because we always represent hours by using 2 digits, let's update this placeholder by adding one more H letter, like so. And at the end of this lesson, just to make our code a little bit more flexible, we can also receive this array of amount of minutes as a parameter into this function. So let's just do this. Here we're gonna declare one parameter, periods in minutes. And then let's move that array periods in minutes inside of constants.js. At the same time, we're gonna rename this constant to follow our convention of naming constants. And finally, we're gonna pass this array into generate period select options function. And since we're not gonna use this period in minutes array anywhere else other than this file, we don't need to export it. So let's remove export keyword. And here we go. Now we have a lot more options to choose amount of time we wish to spend on a particular activity. Link to the source code of this project will be in the video description. Finally, we got to the point when we can start working on the stopwatch. We're going to position our stopwatch under the select box. And by using this stopwatch, we will be able to measure the time spent on a particular activity that we can choose by using this select box. So let's go ahead and add markup for the stopwatch inside of timeline item component, right under base select component. We're going to create div which will contain 3 buttons. Every button in our application is represented by base button component. So we're gonna place in here 3 such components. Also here will be a div which will show the time that we will measure for a particular activity. And then inside of every base button component, we will pass icon components. So the first button will contain icon with the name arrow pass icon. At the same time, we will specify height for this icon, let's say 8 units. The second button will contain an icon with the name pause icon. And the third button will contain an icon called play icon. And then let's just copy class which assigns height and use this class on every icon component. And then we will need to import every icon component. So let's copy over import of icons from constants.js file and paste this import inside of timeline item component. We just have to specify proper icon names in here that we need to import arrow pass icon, pause icon, and play icon. So in the browser, as we can see, all these icons are displayed. Now we will position them on one line. To do that, we can make wrapper element flexible container by assigning class flex. And then we'll make this flexible container stretch full width. And spacing between all child elements will be 2 units. After this, we're going to move play icon with pause icon to the right corner. But firstly, let's assign a few classes to the element which contains time. We're going to make this element flexible container and make this container occupy all available space in its parent flexible container by using flexGrow class. Child elements will be aligned vertically in a center. We'll round corners a little bit, make background color light gray, horizontal paddings will be 2 units, font monospaced, and the text size will be 3XL. And right after assigning all these classes, we can see the following result. Our stopwatch starts looking as we need to. But even though we use base button component inside of timeline item component, it is not imported in this component yet. So let's write corresponding import statement for a base button component. And now all these buttons will get a proper look of base button component. One of these buttons will have a green color and another will have a yellow color. But we don't have such button types in our project that corresponds to these colors. So let's go to constants.js and declare new constants for new button types. We're going to create button type success and button type warning. And of course, values for these constants will be warning and success. And since we also have to include new button types in button types array, let's add the constants of new button types inside of this array. Now we're gonna have to use these new button types within base button component. So in here, first of all, let's import new constants, button type success and button type warning. And just to assign classes for these button types, we need to add one more key, which corresponds to new button type inside of type classes object, which contains classes for every button type. So we're going to add two more keys, which represent our new button types, and for every key, assign corresponding CSS classes. The success button will have a green color, so let's rename this class on green. And the warning button will be yellow color. Let's use class bgyellow500. So now even we have added new button types, we haven't really used those yet. And that is why every button in here looks the same. So let's go back to timeline item component. And we're going to pass prop called type into every base button component with corresponding type to make all these buttons different. So the first button will have type, which corresponds to button type danger constant. In other words, the first button will be red. And now let's copy over this prop and add it to the rest of buttons. But the second button will have button type warning, and the third button's type will be button type success. And of course, after using these constants in this component, we have to import every constant. Let's scroll up and add necessary imports. Here we are using the following constants: button type success, button type warning, and button type danger. And finally, it's time to check result in the browser. And right now, all these buttons have different colors. So our stopwatch looks pretty good now. We'll continue development in the next lesson. So now that we have our markup for stopwatch component ready, we can extract it into its own component. So let's go to the component where this markup is currently located, that is timeline item component. And right here at the very bottom, let's cut all the markup responsible for showing stopwatch, and instead use new component with the name timeline stopwatch. And then we're going to create new file for this component, timeline stopwatch, within components folder. In here we'll create template tag and paste the following markup. And now to use this component, we have to go back to timeline item component and add necessary import of timeline stopwatch component. And of course, we also have to import all those components that are currently used within timeline stopwatch component. One of these components is base button, so let's add a script tag in here and paste base button import. And in the same way, let's cut import of icon components from timeline item component, paste it into our new component. And along with that, let's also move import of all necessary constants: button type success, button type warning, and button type danger. So after this, let's remove import of these constants from timeline item component and check result in the browser. We don't actually see any visual changes, but in Vue DevTools, we can see new component, timeline stopwatch. So now we have to make this component accept one prop from outside, which will be time for the stopwatch. So whenever we're gonna use this timeline stopwatch component, we also will have to pass initial time that this stopwatch should display. So inside of timeline stopwatch component, let's declare new property called seconds by using macro define props. This property will have a default value 0, type will be number, and validator function will be isNumber function. And then let's go up and add necessary import for this isNumber function. We're importing this function from validators module. And back to that component where this timeline stopwatch component is used. And in here we should pass one property called seconds. So now the question is, where do we get the value for the seconds property? And since this current component represents individual timeline item object, amount of seconds that we will pass to a timeline stopwatch component should be actually stored within this timeline item object. But if we take a look at the function which generates timeline item objects, that is this generate timeline items function, we're gonna see that every timeline item object currently contains only two properties, hour and activity ID. So let's go ahead and add one more property which will store amount of seconds spent on a particular activity. We're gonna call this property activity seconds. And initial value for this property will be 0. And after this, we can easily go ahead and reference activity seconds property to pass it to seconds property of timeline stopwatch component, like so. And after we receive this property within timeline stopwatch component, let's use it within template in here. So in Vue DevTools, if we take a look at timeline items array, every object now contains 3 properties, including our new property activity seconds. And then every object from this array will get passed to individual timeline item components within timeline items prop. And of course, that new activity ID property will be included in these objects. And finally, from timeline item component, we're gonna pass value of activity seconds property to timeline stopwatch component as prop called seconds. And sure enough, in the UI we see the value of activity seconds property displayed within stopwatch. But this is not appropriate format for showing time of the stopwatch, so we're gonna have to convert this value into appropriate format. And for that we're gonna use custom function that will soon declare with the name format seconds. And let's use it in here right away. Then let's scroll up and declare this new function format seconds, which is going to receive one param. We'll call it seconds. So here we will create new date object by using date constructor. And then let's just modify time of this object by using another native method called setTime. And in this method we're going to pass the following expression. So let's get an absolute value of the seconds received as a param in this function. And since setTime method accepts value in milliseconds, we're gonna have to convert seconds into milliseconds by multiplying it by amount of milliseconds in 1 second, which is stored within milliseconds in second constant. And then we're going to convert this date object into UTC string. So let's call it method to UTC string. And before doing anything else, let's just see what string we receive within this UTC constant by returning it in here. And by the way, we haven't even declared milliseconds in second constant. So we'll go to constants.js file and add one more constant with the name milliseconds in second. Let's just import this new constant in here and then go to constants.js module. And right above seconds in minute constant, let's export new constant with name milliseconds in second. And the value of this constant will be 1000, which is amount of milliseconds in 1 second. And here's how our time converted to UTC string currently looks like. So we need to extract only necessary part from this whole string, and the substring that we need is this. And we can do so by using another native method, substring, on this UTC string in here. And this method receives 2 indexes, index of the beginning of substring and end of the substring. So by using another method, index of, let's just find position of the colon in this string, go to characters backward. And as for another index, end of the substring, we're going to find the index of the colon, and this time go 6 characters forward. And this is how we extracted only necessary part of initial UTC string. And now let's just do a little refactoring and move this format seconds function to functions.js module, because we try to separate presentation layer from business logic as much as possible. And we try to store all the business logic within functions.js module. So right here we're gonna paste format seconds function and export it. And by the way, we don't have access to milliseconds in second constant in this file, so we also have to import this constant. Let's do so, and remove unnecessary import of this constant from timeline stopwatch component. And what we have to import here instead is our new function format seconds that we have just moved inside of functions module. And here we go, now all stopwatch components show time in appropriate format, just like before, but right now this format is derived dynamically, which will allow us to update this time every second in the future. Link to the source code of this project will be in the video description. Now let's randomly seed activities for every hour to simplify our future testing, so that most of the select boxes will have selected activity. And in our case, from technical perspective, assigning activity ID to activity ID property of timeline item objects. So first of all, to do that, we have to find the function which generates timeline item objects. The function name is generate timeline items, which is called in here in the app component. So let's open up this function definition, and in here we're going to assign randomly selected activity ID to activity ID property of every timeline item object before it gets passed to timeline items array. And to know which activity IDs we can choose, we need to accept activities array as a parameter to this function. Let's call this parameter activities. And from app component, we're going to pass value of this activities array, which is stored within activities reactive variable. So we have to reference value property to access this array and send this as a parameter to generate timeline items function, like this. And now let's change order of these lines. Firstly, we declare activities array, and right after that, we declare timeline items array. And then let's go back to generate timeline items function definition and write logic to randomly select activity ID to be assigned to activity ID property. This can be done in many different ways, since this is just random selection. I'm gonna use the following approach. Let's divide our parameter by 4 and get remainder of this division, and then we'll check if the result is equal to 0. In this case, we're not going to assign activity to this particular timeline item object. So let's use null value in this case. Otherwise, we're going to pick random activity from activities array. And as an index, let's use the following expression. We'll divide our by 2 and get remainder of this division. And then we're going to extract ID out of the received activity object. And as for activity seconds value, we're also going to get remainder of the division of our by 4, compare this result with 0. If they're equal, we're going to use 0 seconds. Otherwise, we will multiply 15 by value of the constant seconds in minute and multiply by variable hour. And then we're going to get remainder of the division of this expression by seconds in hour constant. And in the browser, we will see that many of the select boxes in here now have random activity selected. And additionally, stopwatches show randomly chosen time. And of course, this whole UI is completely dependent on objects from timeline items array. So if we take a look at the values of properties of these objects, specifically activity ID and activity seconds, we will see that they contain specific values. And now that we have main part of our generation logic ready, let's do a refactoring for this part. We will try to rewrite this logic to reduce amount of code. So in here we can create an array by using array constructor. Let's pass amount of elements that we need in this array. We can get amount of elements from our day constant. And then we're going to get only keys of this array by using keys method. Then we're going to get all indexes of this array by using spread operator. And based on that, create new array, which we will iterate over by using map method. And on every iteration of this array, we will get specific index, which represents particular hour. And then we're gonna map these indexes into objects with 3 properties: hour, activity ID, and activity seconds. So let's copy over these 3 properties from here, insert it into our new object, and the old code can now easily be removed. And this way we haven't really changed any logic. We have just done a simple refactoring to minimize amount of code. But now we have a different problem. So for example, we want to remove some activity which is already selected in one of these select boxes. In this case, these select boxes should automatically reset their values. Along with the measured time, the time should also be reset to 0. And to do this, we need to find a function which is responsible to delete activity. It is delete activity function within app component. So in here, before removing the activity, we're going over all timeline item objects. And if some timeline item objects contain activity ID which we're trying to remove, before removing activity, we are resetting activity ID property and assigning null. And the same thing we have to do with activity seconds property. So when we are removing particular activity, this activity seconds property should receive 0 value. And to do this, let's basically assign this value to activity seconds property, like so. And now let's see what will happen when we try to remove some activity, for example, activity reading, which is currently selected in one of the timeline items objects. Let's go ahead and do this, remove reading activity, then go back to timeline item page, and here we can see that those select boxes that previously had a reading activity selected have their activity select box as well as time reset. And of course, corresponding timeline item objects would also have their properties reset, activity ID and activity seconds. At the end, let's go back to the code inside of functions.js file, and from here let's remove import of unused constant midnight hour. And on that, we're finishing this lesson. In this lesson, we're going to make our stopwatch component functional, so we can start a stopwatch, stop it, and reset its time. And the first thing that we should do is to go to timeline stopwatch component and declare new constant. Let's call this constant seconds. This is going to be a reactive variable which will store current time of the stopwatch. And initially this time gets passed from outside within seconds prop. So as initial value for this reactive variable, we're gonna use seconds prop, because later we need to update value with a seconds reactive variable every second. And which is why we have created this constant, because we can't modify value of seconds prop directly. And then we're also going to need another state variable. We'll call it isRunning. And this state variable will store current state of our stopwatch, whether it is running or stopped. Of course, initially our stopwatch will be stopped, so initial value will be false. And now what we have to do is to register handlers for every button. So let's create two separate local functions and bind these functions as event handlers. To start our stopwatch, we're going to use function with the name start. The second function will be called stop to stop the stopwatch. And finally, last function is going to be to reset stopwatch time, which will be called reset. And then let's go ahead and register these functions as event handlers for click event. For reset button, we're going to use reset event handler. For stop button, let's use function with the name stop. And for the start button, we're going to use start function. And then let's start implementing each of these functions. So inside of start event handler, we're gonna have to execute some code every second so that it can update our seconds reactive variable. And in JavaScript, to make some code run in certain intervals, we can use setInterval function. As a first parameter is going to accept closure that will be executed in intervals. And as for the interval itself, we pass the second argument into setInterval function. And we have to execute this function every second, which is why, as a second parameter, we're going to pass value of milliseconds in second constant. And that means our closure will be executed every second. And we can easily modify our seconds reactive variable by incrementing it like so. So before checking it out in the browser, let's go up and import necessary function from the Vue package, ref. And now when we will click on a start button, this event handler will get executed, which will register the function to be executed every second. And this function will modify our reactive variable seconds, which will cause Vue to update certain parts of the DOM that depend on this reactive variable. So let's use this seconds variable in the template. So Vue will update this part of the DOM every second. And just because within this component we refer to some props, we need to store all the props within this object, like so. And one more thing, we need to import new constant milliseconds in second. Let's scroll up and add this import in here. So as we can see in the browser, the first stopwatch shows value of seconds 0. That is because initial value of the seconds prop is 0 within timeline stopwatch component. And also local reactive variable seconds also stores value 0. But once I'm going to start our stopwatch by clicking on the start button, right away we see that interface gets updated every second and value of our local reactive variable seconds is modified every second. But right now time is displayed in the wrong format, so we have to go back to timeline stopwatch component. And before displaying the time by using seconds reactive variable in here, firstly we have to format this time. And to format it, we already have a function called format seconds, so let's use it. And now our time will be formatted, and when we start the timer, we will see that the time is still shown properly, and the amount of seconds gets incremented. And of course, every stopwatch component on this page is completely independent from each other. And we can start several stopwatches at the same time. So now let's determine how we would stop the stopwatch. For this, we're gonna have to stop our interval, initially defined by using setInterval function. And to have an option to stop this interval in the future, we have to store reference to this interval. So we're gonna use another reactive variable called isRunning and store reference on our timer within this reactive variable, like so. And then within stop event handler, we will be able to clear this interval by using native function called clearInterval. And this function accepts a reference to the timer that we'd like to stop. So previously we have stored reference to the timer within isRunning reactive variable. Therefore, we're passing this value as a param within clearInterval function. And in addition to that, we're also going to reset value of isRunning variable by assigning false. So let's check it out. Initially, reactive variable isRunning stores value false. And once I'm going to start the timer right away, we're gonna get number within this variable. And this number is kind of a reference to our timer, started by using setInterval function. And later on, when I decide to stop this timer, I'm just gonna have to click on the stop button. And after that, isRunning variable is back to its initial value, false. And so on. If I'm going to start the timer once again, the reference on the timer will be assigned to isRunning variable. And now there is one more button that we have to work on, which is this reset button. So for the reset button, as a handler, we're gonna use a reset function. And the first thing that we should do in here, once this button will be clicked, is to stop the timer by using another function, stop. Let's call this function right here. And besides stopping the timer, we also have to reset the time. So we're going to assign 0 to seconds reactive variable. And let's check it out. Firstly, let's start this timer. Then let's stop it. Then let's start it again. And finally, let's click on the reset button and see what is going to happen. And just like we have determined, our time gets reset to 0 and interface is updated based on the latest value inside of seconds reactive variable. So looks like so far our stopwatch component works as expected. And now let's do one more improvement, which is we will only show one button at a time, whether it is a start button or stop button, depending on the current state of our stopwatch. And to do this, we're gonna use if directive on base button component, which is responsible for showing stop button, and check if our timer is currently running by using isRunning reactive variable. Then we're gonna use stop button, otherwise our timer is currently stopped, and instead we should show button to start this timer. So let's use else on the start button, like so. And finally in the browser, initially as we can see, only start button gets displayed, and after I start the timer, this button will be replaced by stop button. And when we stop the timer, of course, we're gonna see start button again. And now we are at the good point to finish this lesson. We have successfully implemented functionality to stop, start, and reset stopwatch. Now we're going to add a few improvements to our stopwatch components. And specifically, we're going to disable reset button when current stopwatch time will be 0. And when we start the timer, reset button should be reactivated again. And besides doing that, we're also going to disable start button for all hours but the current one. And as we know, current hour is highlighted with a different color. So first of all, we're gonna go ahead and disable reset button. Let's open up editor and find base button component within timeline stopwatch responsible for showing reset button. It is the first button in here, so let's go ahead and add a disabled attribute. And since we'll have to disable this button when the current stopwatch time will be 0, let's use negation and check reactive variable seconds, like so. Because this is exactly the variable which stores current stopwatch time. So in cases when it is 0, the negation will turn this expression to true, and hence this button will get disabled. And of course, when we're gonna click on the reset button, this event handler will be triggered, and the seconds variable will get value 0, which will also make that reset button disabled. And as we can see, those stopwatches that show the time as 0, all of them have reset button disabled. And in addition to that, if I'm gonna go ahead and try to reset, we should also see that button gets disabled, because this stopwatch's time has become 0. And vice versa, when we will start the timer, this button will be reactivated again because the time is no longer 0. So now let's go next and switch over to Start button. And this button should be disabled for all timeline item components other than the one which represents current timeline hour. And to do so, firstly we have to let timeline stopwatch component know which hour it represents. So we're going to declare another prop with the name hour within timeline stopwatch component. This prop will be required. The type, of course, will be a number, and validation function called isHourValid, which is basically going to check that the past hour should be greater or equal to 0 and less or equal to 23. So let's scroll up and import this validation function isHourValid from validators module. And now it's time to actually pass the value of hour from outside, where we use this timeline stopwatch component that is within timeline item component. So right here, we're going to add another prop called hour, and the hour which this timeline stopwatch component represents we can fetch from our property of timeline item object, because we know that every timeline item object contains 3 properties, one of which is our property. And right now we have all information available to us within timeline stopwatch component to determine when start button should be disabled. So let's create new constant in here is start button disabled. And the way we're gonna determine when the start button will be disabled will be as follows. We're going to check if the value of our prop is not equal to current hour, which we can get by using getHours method on the date object, which represents current date. And now all we have to do is to use disabled attribute on the corresponding base button component, which is responsible for showing start button. And within this disabled attribute, we're going to use our new constant is start button disabled, like so. And this will result to the following. As we can see, all start buttons are now disabled, except one which is included within timeline item object, which represents current hour. And this way we have made user interactions with our stopwatch component a little bit better. Let's keep going in the next lesson. You may have noticed that anytime we open up timeline page, we always end up on the very top of this page. But in fact, it will be good to see that timeline item component, which is responsible for current hour. So we don't have to scroll ourselves to this component. And in this lesson, we're going to implement such behavior so that when we go to timeline page, the page will automatically be scrolled to the current timeline item component. And just as a reminder, every timeline item component shown on this page is represented by timeline item objects from timeline items array. And to be able to scroll the page to a particular timeline item component, we should have a reference to the DOM element of that component. So let's go ahead and implement such behavior. Within the timeline component, we have the loop, which renders individual timeline item components responsible for showing particular hours from 0 to 23. And of course, every such component has root DOM element. Let's use a special attribute called ref on this component and assign the name by using which we will be able to get access to root elements of these components from within script section. And since we're using ref attribute directly on top of the component which is rendered by using v4 directive, this ref with the name template item refs will hold array of elements. So let's create constant with the same name, timeline item refs, and initialize it like this by using already familiar Vue function ref. And as an initial value for this variable, we're going to use an empty array. And this way, by using that ref attribute with the name of this constant timeline item refs, Vue will automatically assign references to timeline item components to the elements of this array. And now just to print out what will be contained within this array, we're gonna use another function from the Vue called onMounted, which in turn receives another closure. And everything that we're gonna put within this closure will be executed after our current component will be mounted to the DOM. In other words, when its markup will be completely rendered in the DOM tree, which is important to access our array of references, timeline item refs, inside of this closure only after when the current component will be ready to use, and fully render it in the DOM. And before checking it out, let's scroll up and import all necessary functions such as onMounted and ref from the Vue package. And there we go, in the console we get array with 24 elements, and every such element is the reference to timeline item component. And as we can see, as many timeline item components we have on the page, as many elements we have within this array. And since all these items in this array are references to timeline item components, by using such references we can gain access to the root elements of these components, which is this li element. And we can do it like this. Since timeline item refs array was created by using ref function, we should access underline array by using value property. And let's try to extract the first element, which will be a reference to the first timeline item component. And to get root element of this component, we can reference property with a name $EL, which is shorthand for element. And sure enough, in the browser we'll see corresponding DOM element, which is a root element of the timeline item component. So right now, just to be able to automatically scroll the page to the current timeline item component, we need to grab the reference to root element of this component. And we can do this in the following way. First of all, let's try to determine current hour. We can do this by using getHours method on the current date object. And then we can use this current hour as an index for timeline item refs array to get timeline item component, which is responsible for showing current hour. But better, let's try to fetch component, which comes before the current hour. So to do this, we just need to subtract 1 from current hour variable. And now that we have this timeline item component in hands, we can easily reference $EL property, which will give us root element of this component. And by using native DOM API to scroll the page to this element, we can use method called scrollIntoView. But also let's not forget that to get access to underline array stored within timeline item refs variable, we need to use value property like so. And now we can see the result. And every time I'm going to refresh timeline page, we should see the page gets scrolled to the current timeline item component, to be more specific, component that comes before it. And this way our current timeline item component will be fully visible. So we don't have to scroll the page ourselves anymore to reach current timeline item. But for some cases our current implementation for scrolling the page will fail. And specifically when the current hour will be midnight hour. So let's try to simulate this behavior by manually assigning midnight hour to current hour constant. So what's special about this is that this expression, when we subtract 1 from current hour, will result in negative value -1. And this is not a valid index for the array. So this whole line will throw an error. Let's check it out. And when I'm going to refresh the page right away in the console, we get the following error, saying that cannot access property EL of an array element. Because in this case we're trying to get array element by using invalid index. So we have to handle this case in a special way. Let's use if statement and check if current hour equals to midnight hour, which is 0. We're going to handle this case a little bit differently. And in all other cases we're going to do what we're currently doing. But when our current hour will be midnight hour, in this case, we will always scroll the page to the very top. And to scroll the page to the top, we can use scrollIntoView method on the body object, like this. And now one more thing that we have to do is to import midnight hour constant from constants module, and we can check it in the browser. And this time when I'm going to refresh the page, the first thing that we see is that we no longer get an error in the console, and our page is always scrolled to the very top. So now let's get rid of that hard-coded value 0, get back our expression to get current hour, and check it again. When we try to refresh the page, we will see that the page will be scrolled to the current timeline item component. And to follow the principle of separation of concerns, let's extract this whole logic responsible for scrolling the page into a separate function. We'll call this function scroll to current timeline item. And just to make things more concise, we can even use reference to this function directly in onMounted function like this. So Vue is going to take care to call scroll to current timeline item function only after current component will be fully mounted on the page. So we have successfully implemented automatic scrolling behavior to the current timeline item on the initial page load. Link to the source code of this project, as always, will be in the video description. In the previous lesson, we have implemented automatic page scrolling to the current timeline item. But for now, automatic scrolling only works on the initial page load. And if, for example, we're gonna try to switch to a different page, then come back to timeline page, in this case, we will see that our page wasn't scrolled to the current timeline item. So we need to find a way to detect when we switch between pages. And for example, when we navigate to the page with the name timeline, we should run the logic to automatically scroll the page to the current timeline item. So right now our application has 3 different pages, and these pages are represented by individual Vue components. First page is represented by the timeline component, second page by the activities component, and finally third page is represented by the progress component. And we already have one reactive variable called current page within root component, which stores current page name and is modified every time when we switch between pages. And in the previous lesson, we have implemented automatic scrolling behavior within the timeline component. So we need to let this component know what page we're currently at. And we can do this by passing additional prop to this component with the name current page, like this. And here we're passing value of the reactive variable called current page, which stores current page name. So let's go ahead and add another property with the name current page in here. We're going to make this property required with the type of string, and validation function will be isPageValid. Now let's scroll up and import this validation function from validators module. And since we're going to reference our props within script section, let's just store all the properties within props constant by assigning the result of execution define props macro to this constant. And now let's recall how we have implemented automatic scrolling behavior to the current timeline item in the previous lesson. And for this we have created local function with the name scroll to current timeline item, which is called after current Vue component will be fully rendered on the page. And as we know, if we have to execute some code after component is fully ready, for this we use unmounted hook and pass the function that we need to execute after component is fully mounted as a first parameter to this unmounted hook. But now, since we will also need to scroll the page to the current timeline item not only on the initial page load, but also if we are navigating to timeline page from another page. So right here, let's use a condition and check if our current page that we received as a prop current page equals to timeline. Only in this case, we're supposed to scroll the page to the current timeline item. And of course, in this case, we can no longer use unmounted hook, because besides initial page load, we're also going to trigger this scrolling behavior when we're navigating to timeline page from another page. And just because of this, unmounted hook is not going to work. So we'll use another function provided by Vue called watchEffect. And this function is basically going to trigger the closure that we're passing within this function every time one of the reactive dependencies used within this closure will be changed. So in this particular case, we're using only one reactive dependency, which is current page prop. And this variable's value changes every time we navigate between pages. So watchEffect will be able to detect page change and rerun this callback. But in this particular case, we need variation of the watchEffect function, and it's called watchPostEffect. And the difference between these two is that watchEffect is gonna rerun callback before Vue will re-render component based on updated values of reactive variables, and watchPostEffect is going to run the callback after Vue updates DOM structure based on new values of reactive variables. So now let's scroll up and import watchPostEffect function from Vue package. And just to be able to visually see what is going on in here, we're going to place here arbitrary console log statements within this closure, and the second one within this if conditional. And also let's not forget an import page timeline constant from constants module. After that, we're ready to check it in a browser. Let's go ahead and do so. So after initial page load, in the console we will see one log, page changed. This is the result of executing that function we passed to watch postEffect function. And further, if we're gonna navigate between different pages, we will see that this log gets printed over and over again, every time we change page. But in addition to that, if we're gonna navigate to the page called timeline, besides page change the log, we're also going to see another log, which we have placed earlier within conditional. So only in this case, when we navigate to a timeline page, we're going to run the logic to scroll the page to the current timeline item. But even now it does not work as expected, and when I try to navigate to timeline page from another page, I see that the scrolling doesn't work and the current timeline item is not in the viewport. So let's go back to the editor and debug it a little bit. In here I'm gonna place debugger statement, and let's see what is going to happen when I try to navigate to timeline page. The execution is currently stopped at that breakpoint, and we may notice that at the moment Vue wasn't able to update DOM structure and show interface of the timeline page. And that's a problem because right after we're trying to scroll the page to the current timeline item. But in fact, at this stage, DOM elements responsible for showing timeline items are not even rendered on the page, because our current page is still activities, as we can see when we stopped at the debugger, and only after the function, which is supposed to scroll the page to the current timeline item, has run, Vue finishes updating the interface and shows new timeline page. And now that we know the problem, we need to somehow tell Vue to wait until it's able to update the interface and render a new page before it goes ahead and tries to scroll the page to the current timeline item. And to run some code only after when Vue finishes updating DOM based on new reactive variable values, we can use already familiar function with the name nextTick. And since this is asynchronous function, we're using await keyword, and of course await keyword is used in pair with another keyword async. Let's use this keyword in front of this closure. And before checking it out in the browser, let's scroll up and import nextTick function from the Vue package, switch over to the browser. And now when I try to do the same thing, specifically going from activities page to timeline page, this time I see that at the point in time when we stopped at the breakpoint, because of deferring execution process by using nextTick function, Vue was able to fully update the interface and render new page that we're trying to navigate to, which is timeline page. So this time we're safe to execute the function which is going to scroll the page to the current timeline item, and everything should work fine in this case, because this time all timeline item elements are present in a DOM, and we can freely scroll to any timeline item element. As we can see, after resuming execution, the page was successfully scrolled to the current timeline item. So now that it's working, let's go back to the editor and remove extra statements, such as console log statements, as well as this debugger statement. And now anytime we're going to navigate to timeline page from another page, the page will be always scrolled to the current timeline item. So in the previous lesson, we have implemented automatic scrolling behavior to the current timeline item on timeline page, not only on the initial page load, but also when we try to navigate to a timeline page from another page. In both of these cases, the page will be automatically scrolled to the current timeline item. And today we're going to improve scrolling behavior and implement functionality which will allow us to scroll the page to a particular timeline item by clicking on the hour label of the corresponding timeline item component. And as for now, we can see that by clicking on hour label, the page is automatically scrolled to the very beginning. So let's start and open the component when markup for this hour label is defined. It is within timeline item component. And now, since we have to implement behavior of scrolling after clicking on our label, that means we have to use click event directive to register listener for the click event. At the same time, we're gonna use modifier which will allow us to prevent default browser behavior when clicking on links. It is prevent modifier. And once this event occurs, in other words, when we click on the hour label, we're going to fire a custom event with the name scroll to hour to parent component. And with this event, we also have to pass some additional data to let parent component know which timeline item component we have to scroll to. So let's just fetch an hour which current timeline item component responsible for. We can do so by referencing our property on timeline item object, like so. And this timeline item object gets passed within this component as a prop with the name timeline item. So right now let's declare new event with the name scroll to hour and assign validation function to the payload of this event. And since payload will be an hour, we should validate our value by using isHourValid function. This way we're making sure that the hours will only be greater or equal to 0 and less or equal to 23. And before going any further, let's import isHourValid function in this file. And now that we are firing custom event scroll to hour back to the timeline component, and along with this event we're passing current hour, which this timeline item component is responsible for. So let's go to the timeline component and register appropriate listener by using scroll to our event name. And this component will be responsible for scrolling the page to the timeline item, our label of which we have clicked on. So right now we're going to have to make this scroll to current timeline item function a little bit more generic, because by using this function, we will not only scroll the page to the current timeline item, but also to a particular timeline item. So let's rename this function and call it scroll to hour. And the hour which we are going to scroll to will be received as a parameter within this function. Let's name this parameter hour. And it's gonna work like this. After clicking on a particular hour label, scroll to hour event gets sent from timeline item component to the timeline component. And this event also contains payload, which equals to the current hour, which gets passed to the first parameter of this handler function, scroll to hour. So right now we no longer need to determine the hour which we're planning to scroll to by using this statement. Let's comment it out, because the hour that we need to scroll to is received within first parameter hour, and we're going to use this parameter within the body of this function instead of current hour constant, like this. But of course, to make the previous behavior work, when we were automatically scrolling the page to the current timeline item on the initial page load, by calling scroll to current timeline item function, and here we need to modify code a little bit. Let's move this line on top of this function call. And right now, since this function no longer exists, we're going to rename it on our new function, scroll to hour. And this function needs first parameter, which is an hour we're supposed to scroll to. And by making this scroll to hour function receive one parameter, we were able to make it generic enough so that it can handle the case of scrolling the page to the current timeline item, as well as all other cases to scroll to a particular timeline item that we can specify as a first parameter. So now it's a good time to check it out in the browser. I'm gonna click on the hour label and let's see what is going to happen. You may notice that the page gets instantly scrolled to the clicked hour. And of course, the previous behavior of scrolling the page to the current timeline item on initial page load remains. As we can see, after the refresh, the page was scrolled to the current hour, which is in my case 12 p.m. And when trying to navigate to timeline page from another page, the page is also scrolled to the appropriate timeline item hour. And at this point we're good to finish this lesson.